The world became warmer after the Ice Age, and life, in many ways, became easier, but the human body did not become stronger in response. Instead, something quiet began to fade. Traits that once helped humans endure cold, hunger, and long effort slowly loosened, as if they were no longer needed. What remains today is a body that still remembers that older world, but no longer fully fits it. A body that tires a little sooner, that seeks comfort a little earlier, that feels slightly out of place in conditions it once survived. If the environment improved, why did the body not follow in the same direction? Why did humans never fully recover after the Ice Age? Long before any memory that can be traced through writing or architecture, the human body was shaped in a world that did not offer stability. The period often called the Ice Age was not a single uniform landscape of ice, but a long stretch of time marked by repeated cycles of cooling, shifting climates, and environments that rarely settled into predictability. Large parts of the northern continents experienced extended cold, while other regions fluctuated between dry and slightly more temperate conditions. What remained consistent was not a single temperature but the presence of constraint. Food was not always available in predictable patterns. Warmth was not guaranteed, and movement was not optional. Over many generations, the human body did not simply exist in this world. It adjusted, slowly and without intention, to meet the demands placed upon it. These adjustments did not appear as dramatic transformations in a single lifetime. They emerged gradually, carried across generations through processes that favored certain traits over others, not because they were ideal, but because they were sufficient to continue. In this sense, the body that developed during these periods was not optimized for comfort, but for persistence under pressure. The difference between these two ideas becomes clearer when considering what the body had to manage on a daily basis. Maintaining internal temperature in cold conditions requires energy, and energy must come from food that is often difficult to obtain. Movement across long distances, whether in search of resources or in response to environmental shifts, was not a rare event but a repeated requirement. Periods of rest were shaped by the surroundings, not by preference, and shelter was often temporary or incomplete. In such conditions, the body did not specialize in peak performance over short durations. Instead, it tended toward consistency over long stretches of time, where small inefficiencies could accumulate into significant consequences. This form of endurance is not easily visible because it does not appear as strength in a moment, but as the ability to continue without interruption. The structure of muscles, the regulation of energy use, and the balance between conserving and expending effort were all influenced by this constant need to sustain activity without certainty of recovery. Importantly, these changes did not occur in isolation from the broader environment. They were tied to patterns that extended beyond individual experience. Climatic shifts altered the distribution of plants and animals, which in turn influenced how and where humans moved. These movements were not directed by long-term planning, but by immediate conditions that required response. Over time, the body adapted to this pattern of responding rather than controlling. This distinction matters because it suggests that the human body was shaped in a context where control over the environment was limited, and where flexibility in response became more valuable than stability in routine. When considering the present, it is easy to assume that a more stable and warmer world would naturally lead to a body that is stronger or more capable. However, the body does not change in direct proportion to comfort or ease. It changes in response to pressure, and when that pressure is consistent, certain traits are reinforced. During the long periods of cold and uncertainty, the pressures were not only physical but continuous. They did not arrive suddenly and then disappear. They remained, shaping each generation in subtle ways. The result was a body that reflects those conditions, even if only partially visible today. This connection to an earlier world is not always obvious, because modern environments rarely recreate the same combination of cold, scarcity, and constant movement. Yet the underlying structure of the body still carries the influence of that time. It is within this context that the question begins to take form, not as a simple comparison between past and present, but as an observation that the body we have today was not originally shaped for the conditions we now experience. Somewhere between those earlier pressures and the present environment, something began to shift, not in a sudden break, but in a gradual change that would continue across generations. The starting point of that change lies in understanding the world that first formed the human body and the kinds of demands that were once unavoidable. As these long periods of cold and instability continued, the human body did not simply endure them in a passive way. It began to reflect a pattern of living that was shaped by repetition rather than by occasional challenge. What mattered was not a single moment of survival, but the ability to continue through many small demands that never fully disappeared. In this kind of environment, the body was not often pushed to extremes for short bursts. Instead, it was required to operate within a narrow margin, where energy could not be wasted and recovery could not be assumed. This created a form of balance that is different from what is often imagined when thinking about strength or resilience. It was a balance built around continuity. One of the most important aspects of this continuity was how the body managed its energy. Energy was not only needed for movement, but also for maintaining warmth, for supporting basic internal functions, and for responding to unpredictable changes in the surroundings. When temperatures drop, the body must work harder to keep internal conditions stable. This process is not visible in an obvious way, but it consumes resources steadily. Over time, bodies that were able to regulate this process more efficiently were more likely to persist. Efficiency in this context does not mean using less energy in total, but using it in a way that avoids sudden depletion. The difference is subtle, but important. It suggests a system that favors steady output over intense fluctuation. This pattern can also be seen in how movement likely occurred across the landscape. Rather than short, intense efforts followed by long periods of complete rest, movement was often spread out over time. Distances could be covered gradually, with pauses shaped by opportunity rather than by design. The body adapted to this rhythm, where stopping completely was not always possible, and continuing at a moderate pace was often necessary. Muscles, joints, and internal systems all functioned within this pattern, reinforcing the ability to sustain rather than to peak. In such conditions, the idea of pushing to a maximum limit and then recovering fully would not have been a reliable strategy. The environment did not provide clear boundaries where effort could be separated from rest. Instead, effort and rest were intertwined, each influencing the other in a continuous cycle. Another element that shaped the body during this time was the relationship between uncertainty and response. Food availability, weather conditions, and the presence of other animals were not predictable in a stable way. This uncertainty required a form of readiness that did not rely on precise timing. The body needed to remain capable of responding without warning, which again favored consistency over extremes. Systems that could adjust gradually were more useful than those that depended on sudden shifts. This does not mean that moments of intense effort never occurred. They likely did, but they were not the dominant pattern that shaped the body over long periods. Instead, it was the accumulation of smaller, repeated actions that left a more lasting imprint. Over generations, these repeated patterns influenced how the body distributed its resources. Energy had to be allocated not only to immediate needs, but also to maintaining the capacity to continue under similar conditions in the future. This created a form of internal prioritization that may not align with how modern environments function. In a world where conditions change less abruptly, and where resources can be stored or accessed more reliably, the need for this type of constant balancing is reduced. But during the Ice Age, it was central. The body was not designed to operate in isolation from its environment. It was part of a system where external pressures continuously shaped internal responses. This relationship is important to keep in mind because it helps explain why certain traits developed in the first place. They were not arbitrary, and they were not aimed at achieving an ideal form. They were responses to conditions that required ongoing adjustment. When considering the idea that humans may not have fully recovered after the Ice Age, it becomes necessary to understand what recovery would even mean in this context. If the body was shaped by continuous pressure, then a reduction in that pressure would not simply reverse the process. Instead, it would begin to alter the direction of change. The traits that were once maintained by necessity would no longer be reinforced in the same way. This does not happen immediately, and it does not produce a clear before and after. It unfolds gradually, as each generation experiences slightly different conditions. The starting point of this shift lies not in a single event, but in the slow disappearance of the patterns that once defined daily life. And it is within these patterns, rather than in isolated moments, that the deeper structure of the human body was formed. When these patterns are viewed across longer stretches of time, another layer becomes visible, one that is less about individual survival and more about how entire groups moved through changing environments. The Ice Age was not defined only by cold, but by movement of landscapes themselves. Glaciers advanced and retreated, coastlines shifted, and regions that once supported certain plants or animals could become less reliable over time. In response, human populations did not remain fixed in a single place for long periods. Movement was not simply a choice, but part of a broader adjustment to a world that was continually rearranging itself. This movement did not follow a simple path or a predictable rhythm. It was shaped by conditions that could change within a few generations, sometimes even within a single lifetime. As groups moved, they encountered new combinations of temperature, terrain, and resource availability. Each of these factors placed slightly different demands on the body, but the underlying pattern remained consistent. The body needed to function across a range of conditions, not just within a narrow, stable environment. This requirement favored flexibility, not in the sense of rapid transformation, but in the ability to operate without relying on a single set of ideal conditions. Over time, this created a form of biological tolerance, where the body could continue to function even when conditions were not optimal. This tolerance is often quiet and difficult to notice, because it does not stand out in moments of ease. It becomes more apparent when conditions are less favorable, and the body is still able to continue without immediate failure. Another aspect of this long-term pattern is how it influenced the structure of daily life across generations. Because environments were shifting, knowledge could not always be fixed in one place or one method. What worked in one region or season might not work in another. This meant that behavior, like the body itself, needed to remain adaptable. While it's not possible to describe specific actions with certainty, the broader pattern suggests a continuous adjustment rather than a stable routine. The body in turn was part of this adjustment, responding not to a single consistent demand, but to a range of recurring pressures. This connection between movement, environment, and bodily response is important when considering what changed after the Ice Age ended. When climates began to stabilize even slightly, the need for constant large-scale movement decreased in many regions. Landscapes became more predictable, and certain areas could support longer-term habitation. This did not happen everywhere at the same time, and it did not eliminate uncertainty entirely, but it introduced a different kind of relationship between humans and their surroundings. Instead of responding to a world that was always shifting, the body began to exist in environments that allowed for more continuity in place. This shift may seem small, but over many generations it changes the kinds of pressures that shape the body. When movement becomes less constant, the demands on muscles, joints, and energy systems begin to adjust. When resources become more predictable, even if only slightly, the way energy is stored and used can also begin to change. These are not immediate transformations, and they do not occur in a uniform way across all populations, but they mark the beginning of a gradual transition from one set of conditions to another. Importantly, this transition does not erase the earlier adaptations. The body does not reset itself simply because the environment has changed. Instead, it carries forward traits that were shaped under previous conditions, even as new patterns begin to emerge. This creates a period where the body exists between two worlds, still influenced by the past, but beginning to respond to a different present. It is within this in-between state that the idea of not fully recovering begins to take shape. If the body was formed under conditions of constant movement and pressure, and those conditions begin to ease, the direction of change does not necessarily lead back to a previous state of balance. Instead, it leads toward a new form, one that reflects the reduced intensity of those pressures. The result is not a clear improvement or decline, but a shift that may feel, in subtle ways, like a loss of something that is difficult to define. Understanding this moment of transition is essential, because it sets the stage for everything that follows. It shows that the human body is not fixed, and that its current form is part of an ongoing process shaped by environments that no longer exist in the same way. The question is not only what the body became, but what it stopped needing to be once the Ice Age came to an end. As the environments shaped by long cycles of cold began to ease, even slightly, the human body did not immediately change with them. What remained was a system that had been formed under conditions of continuous demand, where effort was not separated from daily existence. The body carried this structure forward, even as the external pressures that once required it started to shift. To understand what this means, it becomes necessary to look more closely at how the body functioned when those pressures were still present, not in isolated moments, but across the slow accumulation of days and seasons. The body during these earlier periods can be understood as operating within a narrow margin of stability. It was not built to move between extremes of complete rest and intense exertion, but to remain active at a level that could be sustained without clear boundaries. Energy use followed this pattern. Rather than being stored and released in large bursts, it was managed in a way that allowed for continuation. This required a constant balancing process, where the body adjusted its output in response to subtle changes in the environment, such as temperature, terrain, and the availability of food. When temperatures dropped, more energy was directed toward maintaining internal warmth. When movement increased, energy was redistributed to support muscles and coordination. These shifts did not occur as separate phases, but overlapped continuously, creating a system that rarely settled into a single state. This form of functioning is different from what is often expected in modern conditions, where effort can be more clearly defined and separated from rest. In a world shaped by the Ice Age, the body could not rely on predictable periods of recovery. Rest, when it occurred, was influenced by the environment rather than by intention. Shelter might reduce exposure to cold, but it was often temporary or incomplete. Food intake might restore some energy, but it was not always sufficient to fully replenish what had been used. As a result, the body developed a way of operating that did not depend on full recovery before continuing. Instead, it learned to function while still carrying traces of previous effort. This is an important distinction because it suggests that the body was not aiming for a state of complete restoration between activities. It was maintaining a level of function that could persist even when recovery was partial. Over long periods, this pattern influenced how physical systems were organized. Muscles were not only used for short, intense actions, but for repeated, moderate effort. Joints and connective tissues supported ongoing movement across varied terrain. Internal systems regulated temperature, energy, and basic functions in a way that allowed for continuous adjustment rather than abrupt change. The result was a body that was less dependent on ideal conditions and more capable of operating within constraints. This does not imply that the body was immune to fatigue or strain. On the contrary, those experiences were likely constant, but instead of leading to complete taukuth, they became part of the ongoing state in which the body functioned. Fatigue was not always a signal to stop entirely, but a condition to be managed while continuing. This perspective changes how endurance can be understood. It is not simply the ability to perform over a long duration, but the ability to continue despite incomplete recovery and persistent demand. When the Ice Age began to recede, and environments became somewhat more stable, the necessity for this type of continuous functioning started to diminish. Movement patterns could change, becoming less constant in some regions. Access to resources could become slightly more predictable. Opportunities for rest might become more defined, even if only in small ways. These changes did not remove the need for effort, but they altered its structure. Instead of being spread evenly across time, effort could begin to cluster into more distinct periods, followed by clearer intervals of rest. For a body that had been shaped by continuity, this shift introduced a new dynamic. The systems that had developed to support constant adjustment were now encountering conditions that allowed for more variation between activity and rest. This did not immediately create a mismatch, but it began to change the way those systems were used. Over generations, as these new patterns became more common, the traits that supported continuous effort without full recovery were no longer reinforced in the same way. They did not disappear, but their role began to change. The body, in response, started to move in a different direction, one that reflected the reduced need for constant strain. This shift is subtle, and it does not produce a clear boundary between past and present, but it marks the beginning of a transition away from a body built for uninterrupted demand toward one that operates within a different rhythm. As this gradual shift in environment continued, the body did not lose its earlier structure all at once. Instead, it began to encounter a new kind of pattern, one where the demands placed upon it were no longer evenly distributed across time. Effort started to gather into more distinct periods, and rest, when it appeared, became more defined. This change seems simple, but it introduces a different relationship between activity and recovery, one that the earlier body had not been shaped to rely on. In a world of constant pressure, the body adjusted moment by moment, maintaining a steady level of output that could be sustained. In a world where pressure becomes intermittent, the body begins to experience contrast. There are clearer moments of effort and clearer moments of pause. This contrast alters how internal systems are used, even if those systems themselves have not yet fully changed. Energy management, which once depended on maintaining continuity, begins to adapt to a rhythm that includes more variation. Instead of distributing effort evenly, the body may begin to concentrate it, followed by periods where energy is conserved more fully. Over time, this can influence how energy is stored, how it is released, and how quickly the body expects to recover. It is not that the body becomes more efficient in a simple sense, but that it begins to operate under a different set of expectations. The same can be observed in how movement is organized. Earlier patterns of steady, prolonged movement are gradually replaced in some contexts by more segmented activity. Movement may still cover long distances, but it is more likely to be broken into phases, influenced by the availability of stable locations, shelter, or recurring resources. This segmentation changes how muscles and joints are used. Instead of supporting continuous motion without clear interruption, they begin to experience cycles of use and rest that are more pronounced. Over generations, this can lead to subtle adjustments in how the body responds to effort. Systems that once prioritized endurance under constant strain may begin to accommodate a pattern where effort is followed by recovery, even if that recovery is not always complete. Another important element in this transition is how the body responds to signals of fatigue. In an environment where stopping entirely was not always possible, fatigue had to be interpreted differently. It could not always function as a clear instruction to rest. Instead, it became part of the ongoing state of activity, something to be managed rather than avoided. As conditions change and opportunities for rest become more available, the meaning of fatigue can begin to shift. It may start to act more clearly as a signal to reduce or pause activity, because the environment now allows for that response. This change does not occur instantly, and it does not happen uniformly across all individuals or populations. But over time, it influences how the body balances effort and recovery. The threshold at which activity is reduced may begin to lower, not because the body is weaker in a simple sense, but because the conditions that once required continuation under fatigue are no longer as constant. This creates a subtle but important difference in how the body experiences effort. Where once it was necessary to continue despite strain, it may now become possible, and eventually more common, to stop earlier. This shift can accumulate across generations, shaping how the body interprets its own limits. It is also important to consider that these changes are not directed or intentional. The body does not decide to become less tolerant of continuous strain. It responds to the patterns it encounters most frequently. When those patterns include more opportunities for rest and less constant pressure, the traits that supported uninterrupted effort are no longer reinforced in the same way. They remain present, but they are used differently, and over time, they may become less pronounced. This process is gradual and often invisible when viewed within a single lifetime. It becomes clearer only when considered across long periods, where small changes accumulate into noticeable differences. In this context, the idea of not fully recovering after the Ice Age begins to take on a more specific meaning. It is not that the body lost something suddenly, but that it began to follow a different path once the conditions that shaped it changed. The continuity that once defined daily life was replaced, in part, by variation. And in that variation, the body started to reorganize itself, not toward greater or lesser capability in absolute terms, but toward a form that reflects the new rhythm of its environment. What makes this transition especially important is that the body was not shaped only by cold or by movement in isolation, but by the combination of many pressures acting at once. During the long ages of climatic instability, movement demanded energy, cold increased the cost of maintaining life, and uncertainty limited the possibility of full recovery. These forces overlapped so often that the body adapted to their combined effect rather than to any one of them separately. This is one reason the earlier human body can be understood as a body built for continuous strain. It was not responding to occasional difficulty, It was being formed by a world in which strain was part of the background condition of existence. When that background begins to change, the body does not simply keep its previous balance intact. It begins, slowly, to loosen around the edges. One way to see this more clearly is to consider how the body responds when a demand is no longer constant. Traits that are reinforced by repeated necessity tend to remain more stable across generations. Traits that are used less consistently do not always disappear, but they are no longer held in place with the same force. In earlier conditions, the ability to continue under fatigue, to regulate warmth under repeated cold exposure, and to sustain moderate effort over long stretches would have remained relevant again and again. These were not rare advantages. They were woven into daily survival. But as climates became less severe in many regions, as certain landscapes became more predictable, and as opportunities for pause and shelter slowly increased, the repeated necessity of these traits became less absolute. This does not mean the body stopped facing hardship. It means the pattern of hardship changed. And when the pattern changes, the body begins to shift with it. This shift does not require a dramatic biological event. It can emerge from small changes in what is demanded most often. A body that once needed to remain ready for continuous effort may, over many generations, become more accustomed to alternating between effort and recovery. A body that once had to tolerate repeated discomfort without clear relief may begin to respond earlier to strain because earlier relief is now more possible. These are subtle adjustments, but they matter. They suggest that the earlier body was not simply stronger in a general sense. It was more tightly matched to a world of constant pressure. Once that world receded, the match became less exact. The body carried forward its older inheritance, but it no longer had to express every part of it in the same way. This also helps explain why modern feelings of effort can seem slightly out of proportion to what the body once endured. In the present, fatigue often arrives within environments that are safer, warmer, and more controlled than those of the distant past. Yet the feeling of tiring early does not necessarily mean something has gone wrong in a narrow medical sense. It may reflect a long historical change in what the body has been shaped to expect from its surroundings. The body we live in today still comes from that deeper origin, but it has passed through many generations in which the old pressures were reduced, broken apart, or redistributed. What remains is not a body disconnected from the Ice Age, but one that no longer lives under the same terms that once formed it. This is where the central question begins to deepen. To say that humans never fully recovered after the Ice Age does not mean they failed to return to some ideal condition. It means that the end of the Ice Age did not restore balance in a simple way. Instead, it removed a set of pressures that had been actively maintaining certain forms of endurance, tolerance, and continuity. Once those pressures weakened, the body did not remain unchanged. It began moving in a different direction, shaped by a new rhythm of life. That direction may have allowed for other forms of adaptation later, but it also meant that some of the older fit between body and hardship became less complete. The human body, then, was built in one world and carried into another. At first, the connection between those worlds remained strong, but little by little, the demands that once sharpened the body into a tool of steady survival became less constant. And when the sharpening slows, the edge does not vanish all at once. It simply becomes less necessary to keep. The end of the Ice Age is often imagined as a release, as if the world opened and life simply became easier. In some ways, that is true. In many regions, vast sheets of ice retreated, growing seasons changed, coastlines slowly redrew themselves, and landscapes that had once been shaped by severe cold began to support different patterns of plant and animal life. Yet from the perspective of the human body, this was not a simple improvement. It was the beginning of a new kind of instability, quieter than deep cold, but no less important. The body that had been formed under long pressure did not step into a world that rewarded the same qualities in the same way. Instead, the very conditions that had once helped preserve certain forms of endurance began to weaken. The cold had done more than make life difficult. It had acted as a constant filter. Not every day was equally severe, and not every region faced the same temperatures, but across long stretches of time, cold remained a background force that shaped energy use, movement, and survival. To stay warm required fuel. To keep moving through exposed landscapes required steady output. To live where weather could shift quickly required tolerance for discomfort and incomplete recovery. These demands did not create a perfect body. They created a body held in place by repeated necessity. When that necessity began to ease, the change was not only external, it reached inward, because a body maintained by constant demand begins to drift when that demand is reduced. This is why a warmer world does not automatically produce a stronger one. The human body does not simply improve when hardship fades. It changes according to what is repeatedly required of it. If one kind of pressure disappears, the traits once sharpened by that pressure are no longer reinforced with the same consistency. After the Ice Age, many human groups still faced hunger, exposure, disease, and difficult movement. Hardship did not vanish. But the structure of hardship began to change. In some places, cold ceased to be the central force around which everything else was organized. Seasons became more predictable. Certain environments could support longer stays. Food sources in some regions could be tracked with a little more regularity. These shifts did not create comfort in a modern sense, but they did begin to reduce the constant total grip that cold had once held over daily life. That matters because the body had not merely adapted to challenge, it had adapted to a particular pattern of challenge, one that was continuous, costly, and difficult to escape. Once that pattern softened, the body no longer had to prove the same things in the same way. The link between survival and constant physical strain began, slowly, to loosen. This did not happen as a sudden break between one generation and the next. It unfolded gradually, almost invisibly, through repeated small differences in how life was lived. A body that once had to sustain warmth under heavy environmental pressure might now face that pressure less often. A body that once moved because staying still carried higher risk might now spend longer periods within a more familiar territory. A body that once operated under the assumption that recovery would always be partial might now encounter slightly clearer boundaries between effort and pause. None of these shifts sound dramatic on their own, but together, across centuries and millennia, they change what the body is being asked to remain good at. This is the deeper meaning of the transition after the Ice Age. The world did not simply become gentler, it became different in a way that removed a long-standing biological discipline. The body was still the descendant of those earlier conditions, but it was no longer being shaped by them with the same intensity. That is why the end of the Ice Age can be understood not only as a climatic turning point, but as the beginning of a long biological easing, where some older capacities were no longer kept under constant tension. The human body did not fail in this new world. It adapted again. But in adapting to a world less dominated by cold, it also began to move away from the exact form that cold had once helped preserve. Somewhere in that slow movement away, the first signs of not fully recovering had already begun. As the influence of constant cold began to weaken, it did not simply leave an empty space behind. It changed how other forces interacted with the human body. During the Ice Age, cold had acted as a dominant constraint, shaping how energy was used and how movement was sustained. When that constraint eased, other factors did not disappear, but they became less tightly bound together. Instead of a single, persistent pressure guiding the body's adjustments, multiple smaller pressures began to operate with more variation. This shift matters because the body responds not only to the presence of difficulty, but to the structure of that difficulty over time. In a world where cold was a steady background force, the body's responses were organized around continuity. In a world where that force becomes less central, responses begin to fragment. One way to understand this is to consider how energy demands become less synchronized. Earlier, maintaining warmth, supporting movement, and managing uncertainty often occurred together. These demands overlapped so frequently that the body adapted to handle them as part of a single ongoing state. As climate stabilized in many regions, these demands began to separate. There could be periods where temperature was less taxing, even if food remained uncertain. There could be times when movement was reduced without an immediate increase in exposure. This separation does not eliminate difficulty, but it changes how often different systems are engaged at the same time. Over generations, this alters the pattern of reinforcement. Traits that once worked together under constant overlap are no longer required in the same combination or with the same frequency. As a result, the body begins to adjust to a more varied set of demands, rather than a tightly integrated one. This does not create a stronger or weaker system in simple terms. It creates a different kind of system, one that is less anchored to a single mode of operation. Another important change lies in how the body experiences recovery. In earlier conditions, recovery was limited by the environment. Even when activity paused, cold could continue to draw energy from the body, and uncertainty could prevent full restoration. Recovery was partial and often short-lived. As environments became less dominated by cold, opportunities for more complete recovery began to appear, even if only occasionally. This does not mean that rest became abundant or reliable, but it became more distinct. The body could begin to experience clearer contrasts between effort and recovery, even if those contrasts were still modest. Over time, this distinction influences how the body regulates itself. Systems that once operated under the assumption of constant strain may begin to adapt to a pattern where restoration plays a more visible role. This can gradually change how the body anticipates and responds to effort. Instead of maintaining a steady output regardless of conditions, it may begin to adjust more noticeably between phases of activity and rest. This change can be subtle, but it affects how the body manages its limits. When recovery becomes more possible even in small ways, the need to continue under incomplete recovery is reduced. This does not eliminate endurance, but it changes how endurance is expressed. The body may no longer be required to sustain the same level of output without pause, and over generations, the systems that supported that pattern are used less consistently. At the same time, the more stable conditions in some regions begin to allow for longer-term presence in particular environments. This does not mean immediate settlement in the way it is often imagined, but it introduces a shift from constant relocation to more repeated use of familiar areas. This familiarity can reduce certain types of strain. Movement may still be necessary, but it may follow more predictable paths. Resources may still vary, but their patterns can be observed over longer periods. These changes reduce the need for constant adjustment at the same intensity. The body, in response, begins to operate within a framework that includes more repetition of place and pattern, rather than constant adaptation to entirely new conditions. When viewed across many generations, these shifts create a gradual reorganization of how the body is shaped. The earlier system, built under overlapping and continuous pressure, gives way to a system influenced by variation and partial stability. The difference is not immediately visible, but it accumulates. It changes how energy is distributed, how movement is structured, and how recovery is experienced. In this context, the idea of not fully recovering after the Ice Age becomes clearer. The body did not lose its earlier capacities in a sudden way. It began to use them less often, in a world where they were no longer required with the same consistency. And as their use diminished, their role within the body's overall function began to shift, marking another step in the long transition away from the conditions that had once defined human existence. What followed from this change was not an immediate decline, but a slow release from a condition that had once kept the body under steady demand. This is an important distinction, because the end of the Ice Age did not remove hardship from human life. It altered the pattern through which hardship shaped the body. A body that had long been maintained by overlapping pressures now entered environments where those pressures became less unified, less constant, and in some places less severe. The effect of this was not dramatic enough to be felt within a single generation, but across long stretches of time, it changed what the body was repeatedly required to preserve. During the colder ages, certain capacities remained relevant not because they were extraordinary, but because life kept returning to them. The ability to sustain effort while underfed, the ability to remain functional while exposed to cold, the ability to continue moving despite incomplete recovery, all of these were not rare advantages. They were repeatedly called upon by the environment itself. When the climate softened and stability increased in some regions, even modestly, these same capacities were no longer tested with the same regularity. This is where the deeper biological shift begins. Traits do not need to disappear in order to matter less. They only need to be demanded less often. Once that happens, the body begins to reorganize around a different average of daily life. The body does not keep every older capacity equally sharpened when the world no longer presses on them with the same force. Instead, it starts to distribute its resources according to the newer pattern of demands. This can happen without any clear sign of loss at first. Life may even appear easier, more stable, more manageable, But what is easing on the surface may also be relaxing a form of biological discipline that had once kept the body closely matched to hardship. One of the quiet consequences of this release is that the body no longer has to remain equally prepared for continuous strain. It can begin to rely more on intervals, more on changes in rhythm, more on the possibility that not every day will demand the same sustained output. Over generations, this changes how effort is organized within the body. Systems that once had to remain ready for long, uninterrupted use can begin to function within a looser structure, one where periods of strain are more clearly separated from periods of relief. This is not a flaw. It is a response to a changing world. But it also means the body is moving away from the exact conditions that once forged it. The older fit between body and environment starts to loosen, not because the body has failed, but because the environment is no longer holding it in the same shape. This is why the phrase "never recovered" carries a paradox. It suggests that something was lost after conditions improved. And that is precisely what makes the question so unsettling. We usually imagine recovery as a return to strength after difficulty. But in evolutionary terms, the removal of difficulty does not always strengthen a body. Sometimes it changes what strength means. A body that no longer has to endure the same steady cold, the same repeated movement, or the same incomplete recovery may gradually become less defined by those capacities. It is still capable, still adaptive, still human, but it is no longer being shaped by the same relentless filter. What remains is a body that still carries the inheritance of the Ice Age without fully living under its rules. That creates a quiet mismatch. The body still comes from a world of persistent demand, yet it has spent thousands of years adjusting to environments where that demand has been softened, broken apart, or delayed. This does not produce a dramatic break between past and present. It produces something more subtle and more familiar. It leaves a body that can still do difficult things, but often feels as though it reaches for relief sooner than the older world would have allowed. A body that still remembers pressure, but no longer lives inside the same constant necessity. That is what makes the end of the Ice Age more than a climate story. It marks the beginning of a long biological easing, where the human body was not freed into a higher form, but slowly guided away from the exact tension that had once kept some of its older endurance in place. And once that tension began to fade, the body did not return to what it had been. It began, almost imperceptibly, to become something else. When the steady pressure of the Ice Age began to ease, the human body did not respond with a clear shift toward improvement or decline. Instead, it entered a state where certain traits were no longer held in place as firmly as before. This is not because those traits lost all value, but because the conditions that once required them again and again became less consistent. In evolutionary terms, what matters most is not whether a trait is useful in rare moments, but whether it is needed often enough to be maintained across generations. During the long periods of cold and instability, many aspects of the human body were reinforced simply because they were constantly called upon. The ability to endure discomfort, to continue under fatigue, and to function with limited recovery were not optional qualities. They were part of the regular pattern of survival. Once that pattern began to change, the reinforcement of those traits also began to shift. This shift does not occur through sudden transformation. It unfolds gradually as the balance between what is required and what is optional begins to move. When a demand is constant, even small differences in how the body meets that demand can have long-term effects. But when that demand becomes less frequent or less intense, the difference between maintaining a trait and letting it soften becomes less pronounced. Over many generations, this creates what can be understood as a form of biological drift. The body is no longer being tightly guided by a single set of pressures, and as a result, it begins to explore a wider range of possibilities within its existing structure. This does not mean that the body becomes random or uncontrolled. It means that the constraints shaping it become less rigid. One way to understand this is to think about how often certain capacities are used. In the earlier environment, the body's systems for managing prolonged effort were engaged almost daily. They were not pushed to extremes, but they were used consistently enough to remain central to how the body functioned. As the environment changed, those same systems may have been called upon less regularly or under different conditions. They were still present, still capable, but no longer at the center of daily demand. This change in frequency matters because it influences how the body allocates its internal resources over time. Systems that are used less often are not necessarily removed, but they may become less emphasized. The body begins to balance itself around the most common patterns it experiences, not around the most demanding ones it rarely faces. This is a subtle process, and it can be difficult to notice because it does not produce immediate or obvious effects. It does not create a clear moment where the body becomes different. Instead, it shifts gradually, generation by generation, as the environment continues to apply a different kind of pressure. Over long periods, this can lead to a body that is still capable of enduring strain, but does not maintain the same level of readiness for it. The difference is not always visible in what the body can do at its limits, but in how it behaves before reaching those limits. It may respond to effort earlier, seek rest sooner, or redistribute energy in ways that reflect the new pattern of demands. Another important aspect of this drift is that it does not require a new direction to be imposed from outside. It emerges naturally from the absence of the old constraints. When the environment no longer enforces a strict pattern, the body does not hold itself to that pattern indefinitely. It adjusts to what is now common, rather than what was once necessary. This helps explain why the end of the Ice Age did not lead to a simple recovery or strengthening. The body was not returning to a previous state of balance. It was moving into a different state altogether, shaped by a reduction in the pressures that had once defined it. In this sense, the idea of never fully recovering becomes less about loss in a direct sense, and more about the absence of reinforcement. What is not consistently required is not consistently maintained. And over time, that absence reshapes the body in ways that are quiet but lasting. The traits that once allowed humans to persist under constant strain did not vanish, but they began to loosen, as the world that had once demanded them slowly receded. Once this loosening begins, it does not announce itself in any dramatic way. There is no clear threshold where one generation can see that a trait once held tightly by necessity has started to soften. The process is quieter than that. It unfolds through ordinary lives lived under slightly different conditions, where the body is still asked to work, still asked to endure, but not always in the same pattern, and not with the same relentless consistency as before. This is what makes biological drift so difficult to notice. It does not look like failure. It often looks like normal variation, yet across long periods of time, normal variation can become a new average, especially when the old pressures that once narrowed the range of possible bodies are no longer acting with the same force. During the colder ages, the room for variation was likely more limited in certain respects, not because all humans were the same, but because the environment repeatedly pressed on the same broad capacities. A body that could not manage energy steadily, tolerate repeated discomfort, or continue under partial recovery would face greater difficulty in a world where those conditions returned again and again. Once the climate softened in many regions and the structure of daily strain became less unified, that narrow shaping force began to widen. The body was no longer being corrected so firmly by the environment. It could begin to vary more around the edges without immediate cost. This widening matters because evolution does not only work by creating new forms, it also works by relaxing the conditions that once prevented certain forms from becoming common. What had once been held in place by constant need can begin to spread into a broader range of outcomes when that need fades. The body, in other words, does not simply lose traits as if they were objects dropped from the hand. It becomes less strictly organized around them. Their expression grows less uniform, less central, and sometimes less reliable as a shared pattern across generations. This is especially important when thinking about endurance, tolerance for discomfort, and the ability to continue under low-level strain. These are not traits that need to disappear completely to change the human experience. They only need to become less consistently reinforced. Once that happens, the body may still retain them in partial form, but no longer as strongly as a baseline condition. The result is subtle. People may still be capable of significant effort, but the body may reach for rest sooner, respond more clearly to fatigue, or depend more heavily on opportunities for relief that earlier conditions did not regularly allow. That kind of change is easy to misread, because it does not necessarily reduce what the body can achieve in a single moment. Instead, it alters the rhythm under which the body prefers to operate. It shifts the balance away from uninterrupted strain and toward a more segmented relationship with effort. Another reason this drift matters is that it accumulates through generations who do not experience the original environment directly. The farther human populations moved from the persistent cold and instability that had shaped earlier bodies, the less direct the old demands became. Yet the body still carried the inheritance of that older world. This creates a long transition where older structures remain present, but the daily pressures that once sharpened them are reduced. In such a transition, the body does not remain frozen in its previous condition. It follows the pressures that are still active. If those pressures become more varied, less overlapping, and more forgiving in some regions, then the body will slowly reorganize itself around that new pattern. This helps explain why the end of the Ice Age did not produce a simple strengthening through comfort. Comfort, in evolutionary terms, does not preserve the same traits that hardship once held in place. A body shaped by continuous demand can begin to drift when continuous demand is no longer the center of life. And because this drift happens without a clear break, it can pass unnoticed for a very long time. What changes first is not always the outer form of the body, but the stability of the pattern behind it. The body remains human, remains adaptive, remains deeply connected to its ancient origin, but its older alignment with constant strain begins to loosen, not because that alignment was rejected, but because the world no longer insisted on it with the same patience and force. As this widening of variation continues, the body begins to settle into a new kind of balance, one that is shaped less by a single dominant pressure and more by a mixture of changing conditions. This balance is not fixed. It shifts gradually, influenced by what is most often required and what is no longer consistently demanded. In the earlier world of prolonged cold and instability, the range of possible responses was narrower, not because the body lacked flexibility, but because the environment repeatedly guided it toward the same forms of endurance. Once that guidance weakens, the body does not remain tightly aligned with it. It begins to distribute its capacities differently, reflecting a broader and less predictable set of conditions. This redistribution does not produce a clear loss that can be easily measured. Instead, it alters how the body organizes effort, recovery, and tolerance. Systems that were once tuned to operate under continuous demand may begin to function within a more flexible pattern, where effort is followed by clearer intervals of rest, and where strain is less evenly spread across time. Over generations, this can change how the body anticipates activity. Rather than maintaining a steady readiness for ongoing effort, it may begin to rely more on cycles, adjusting between phases of exertion and recovery in a way that reflects the newer environment. This change is subtle, but it affects how the body experiences its own limits. In a system shaped by constant pressure, limits are often encountered gradually as part of an ongoing process. In a system shaped by variation, limits may appear more distinctly, marking the transition between activity and rest. This can create the impression that the body reaches those limits sooner, even if its overall capacity has not disappeared. It is not only the presence of a limit that matters, but how and when that limit is approached. Another layer of this shift can be seen in how discomfort is interpreted. Under earlier conditions, discomfort was a common and persistent element of daily life. It could not always be avoided, and it often did not lead directly to stopping. Instead, it became part of the background within which activity continued. As environments change and opportunities for relief become more frequent, discomfort can take on a different role. It may begin to function more clearly as a signal, one that encourages adjustment or pause when conditions allow. Over time, this can influence how the body responds to similar levels of strain. The threshold at which activity is reduced may shift, not because the body has become incapable, but because it is no longer required to ignore those signals as often as before. This is an important distinction, because it shows that what appears as reduced tolerance may also be a change in how the body is allowed to respond. The earlier body was shaped in a world where response options were limited. The later body exists in conditions where those options are more varied. The difference lies not only in physical capacity, but in the relationship between the body and its environment. When the environment imposes continuous demand, the body adapts by sustaining effort within that demand. When the environment allows for variation, the body adapts by incorporating that variation into its functioning. Over many generations, this leads to a form that is no longer held to the same strict pattern as before. It remains capable of endurance, but it does not maintain that endurance in the same constant way. This gradual reorganization helps clarify why the end of the Ice Age did not lead to a straightforward recovery. There was no previous state waiting to be restored once the cold receded. The body had been shaped by a specific set of pressures, and when those pressures changed, the direction of adaptation changed with them. What followed was not a return, but a continuation along a different path. In that continuation, some earlier capacities became less central, not because they were no longer possible, but because they were no longer demanded with the same regularity. The human body, in this sense, did not step back from the Ice Age into a stronger form. It stepped forward into a different kind of balance, one where the tight alignment with constant strain began to loosen, and where variation slowly replaced continuity as the defining pattern of daily life. One of the quietest changes after the Ice Age may have taken place in the way the human body handled energy. Cold had once made energy impossible to ignore. In colder environments, the body must spend more simply to remain alive in a stable internal state. Warmth is not passive. It has to be maintained, and when the air, the ground, and the wind repeatedly pull heat away, the body must answer with a steady internal cost. That cost shaped more than temperature alone. It influenced how food was used, how effort was paced, and how long the body could continue before reaching its limits. During the long ages of instability, this meant that energy was not something the body could afford to treat casually. It had to be managed across movement, exposure, and uncertain access to food, often all at once. In such a world, the body was not simply burning more, it was organizing itself around a constant background drain. That kind of drain changes how a body functions. It encourages a rhythm in which energy is spread carefully, where sudden waste carries a larger penalty, and where the line between basic survival and physical effort is thinner than it appears in more stable conditions. The body formed under those pressures had to keep multiple demands running together. It had to maintain warmth while also supporting movement. It had to continue through fatigue, while also preserving enough internal balance to remain functional the next day. Energy in that context was never devoted to a single task in isolation. It was divided, redirected, protected, and used under conditions where the environment kept asking for more. When the Ice Age receded, this arrangement did not vanish overnight, but the pressure behind it began to weaken. In many regions, the cost of simply staying warm became less relentless. Seasons still changed, cold still mattered, and hardship remained real, but the body was no longer living under the same broad and persistent thermal demand that had once shaped so much of daily life. That change may seem like a clear advantage, and in many ways it was. Yet biologically, it also meant that one of the oldest and most constant forces acting on human energy use had begun to loosen. Once that happened, the body no longer needed to organize energy in quite the same way. A system built under constant energetic pressure does not remain fixed when the structure of that pressure changes. It begins to adapt to a new pattern, one in which the background cost of survival may be lower in some conditions, while the timing of effort becomes more variable. This shift matters because the body does not only respond to how much energy is used, but to when and why it must be used. In the colder world, energy had to remain available for steady overlapping demands. In a less severe world, those demands could begin to separate. The body might face effort without the same constant thermal burden, or recovery without the same immediate drain from exposure. Over generations, this changes what the body is practicing most often. It no longer has to remain equally prepared for continuous energetic strain. It can begin to move toward a more uneven rhythm, where energy is spent in clearer phases and conserved in others. This does not make the body simpler. It makes it different. The earlier body had been shaped by a world where energy pressure was broad, constant, and difficult to escape. The later body begins to inherit a world where that pressure is more broken apart. Once again, the result is not a sudden loss, but a redirection. The body still carries the old design, but it no longer has to express it under the same conditions. That may help explain why modern effort often feels strangely inconsistent. The body can still work hard, sometimes impressively hard, but it does not always seem built for the same slow, uninterrupted drain that earlier conditions demanded. It may reach for food, warmth, or pause sooner, not because something has simply gone wrong, but because the world that once trained energy use under constant pressure has receded. The human body still comes from that older beginning, but its relationship to energy has been passing through a long transition ever since. And if the Ice Age helped shape a body that could live under relentless energetic demand, then the end of that age may also mark the beginning of a body that no longer had to hold that same discipline quite so tightly. As the constant pull of cold on the body's energy began to lessen, another subtle shift followed, one that was not about how much energy the body used, but how it expected that energy to be available. In the earlier world, energy could not be separated cleanly into moments of use and moments of storage. It was always being drawn upon, often in overlapping ways, and the body had to manage this by keeping its systems prepared for continuous demand. There was little room for the assumption that energy would be fully restored before it was needed again. Instead, the body learned to operate within a state of partial replenishment, where it continued to function even when resources were not completely renewed. This pattern shaped how energy was stored, accessed, and distributed across different systems. It encouraged a form of readiness that did not depend on clear cycles. When that pattern begins to loosen, the expectations around energy begin to change as well. In environments that allow for slightly more predictable access to food, slightly more stable shelter, or slightly clearer pauses between effort, the body encounters a different rhythm. Energy can begin to accumulate in more noticeable ways, and recovery can become more distinct, even if still incomplete. Over time, this alters how the body organizes its internal priorities. Instead of maintaining a constant readiness for overlapping demands, it can begin to rely more on the idea that energy will be available when needed, and that there will be moments to restore what has been used. This shift does not happen all at once, and it does not remove the need for careful energy use, but it changes the balance between immediate use and deferred replenishment. The body begins to operate within a framework where energy can be gathered and released in more defined phases. This introduces a new dynamic, one that was less central under the continuous pressures of the Ice Age. The presence of even small intervals of relative stability allows the body to adjust its expectations, to move toward a pattern where effort and recovery are more clearly separated. As this pattern repeats across generations, it influences how energy systems are maintained. The need to function under constant partial depletion becomes less central, and the body may begin to rely more on periods of restoration, even if those periods are not always complete or reliable. This can gradually change how the body responds when energy is low. In earlier conditions, low energy did not always lead to stopping, because stopping was not always possible. The body had to continue, adjusting its output while maintaining function. In later conditions, where pauses are more possible, low energy can more often lead to reduction or cessation of activity. Over time, this can shift the threshold at which the body chooses to conserve rather than continue. It is not that the body loses the ability to function under strain. It is that it becomes less frequently required to do so, and therefore less consistently organized around that requirement. This difference can shape how fatigue is experienced. Fatigue may arise earlier in a context where the body anticipates the possibility of rest, because the environment allows that expectation to exist. The signal itself is not necessarily stronger, but it may be acted upon differently. This creates a subtle but important change in the relationship between effort and energy, where once the body had to extend itself across long periods with limited recovery, it can now begin to alternate more clearly between use and restoration. This alternation becomes part of the body's learned pattern, even if it remains imperfect. Across generations, such patterns accumulate, gradually shifting how energy is managed at a fundamental level. The earlier discipline, shaped by constant energetic pressure, does not disappear entirely. It becomes one layer within a more complex system, one that now includes the expectation of variation. This helps explain why the body today may seem to move between states of effort and fatigue more distinctly than might be expected from its deeper evolutionary origins. It is not only the amount of energy that has changed, but the structure of how that energy is used and anticipated. The end of the Ice Age did not remove the need for energy management, but it altered the conditions under which that management takes place. And in that alteration, the body began to follow a new rhythm, one that reflects a world where energy is no longer drawn down in the same continuous way as before. What makes this long change in energy use so important is that it does not remain hidden inside metabolism alone. Over time, it begins to shape how the whole body approaches effort, recovery, and even discomfort. A body formed under the long, cold pressures of the Ice Age had little reason to expect clean boundaries. Warmth had to be maintained while moving. Hunger could exist alongside physical strain. Fatigue often arrived without guaranteeing rest. Under those conditions, the body learned to spread energy across overlapping needs rather than reserve it for clearly separated tasks. This created a kind of discipline that was quiet, but powerful. It did not depend on sudden output. It depended on remaining functional while multiple demands stayed active at once. That is a very different energetic world from one in which demands begin to separate and recovery becomes more visible. As the colder world loosened its hold, the body no longer had to carry the same uninterrupted burden of thermal cost, movement, and uncertainty in exactly the same combination. In some places, it could spend longer periods without severe exposure. In some places, food could be approached with slightly more pattern and familiarity. In some places, shelter and repeated use of the same landscape allowed a more stable relationship between effort and pause. These were not luxuries in any modern sense. They were still difficult lives, but they changed the average shape of energetic demand. Once that average changes, the body does not preserve its old energy habits out of memory alone. It begins to adapt to the new rhythm that is being asked of it most often. This is where the deeper consequence appears. A body that no longer needs to sustain the same constant background drain may gradually become less organized around enduring it. The systems for steady continuation remain, but they are not reinforced in the same way. Instead of being called into service almost continuously, they begin to share space with a different pattern, one where phases matter more. There can be clearer starts and stops, clearer times of use and times of restoration. Over generations, this does not simply change how much energy is used, it changes how the body expects effort to feel. Effort may become something the body enters and exits more distinctly, rather than something it carries in a long, low, unbroken line. This difference may help explain why early fatigue can feel so familiar in the present. The body still carries ancient capacities, but it has also spent thousands of years in environments where it was less often forced to ignore fatigue and continue anyway. Once the pressure to continue under depletion becomes less constant, the threshold for easing off can begin to shift. Not because the body is failing, and not because people in the past were somehow superhuman, but because the biological meaning of daily strain has changed. The older body had to hold energy in a pattern shaped by continuous necessity. The later body is increasingly shaped by alternation. And alternation changes behavior at a deep level. It allows the body to lean more fully into signals that once had to be endured. It allows recovery to become a more active part of the pattern rather than a narrow interruption within ongoing demand. Seen this way, the end of the Ice Age did not simply reduce hardship. It changed the structure through which hardship interacted with the body's energy systems. The human body did not become detached from its old origins, but it did begin to loosen from the exact discipline those origins imposed. That loosening matters because energy is not just fuel. It is the basis on which movement, warmth, tolerance, and persistence all depend. When the energetic world changes, the body's relationship to its own limits begins to change as well. The result is not a body that has forgotten the Ice Age, but one that no longer lives under its steady training. What remains is a body still shaped by an older, harsher world, yet increasingly practiced in another kind of rhythm. And when a body is shaped by one rhythm but lives for long enough inside another, it does not keep both with equal strength. It slowly leans toward the one it now meets most often, even if some part of its deeper design still points back toward the cold beginning, where human endurance was once held in place by constant energetic pressure. After the long cold ages began to recede, one of the most important changes was not only in temperature, but in the pattern of daily movement itself. In the earlier world, movement had been deeply tied to uncertainty. Landscapes shifted, resources could not always be depended upon in the same places, and the body had to remain ready to cross distance as part of staying alive. Movement was not simply exercise, and it was not chosen for its own sake. It was woven into survival, often without clear separation between necessary effort and ordinary existence. When climates became somewhat more stable in many regions, this relationship slowly began to change. The human body did not stop moving, and life did not suddenly become settled or easy, but the rhythm of movement started to lose some of its old continuity. In places where environments became more predictable, people could return to familiar ground more often, remain longer within known areas, and depend a little less on constant large-scale adjustment. This matters because the body is shaped not only by how far it can move, but by how often movement is required as a condition of life. A body that must move regularly across uncertain ground develops under a different discipline than a body that can pause more often, repeat known routes, and remain longer within a recognizable environment. During the Ice Age, movement was part of the background structure of living. It did not always appear as dramatic travel. Much of it may have been steady, repeated, and spread across time, shaped by following opportunity and avoiding loss. The body was formed within that long pattern. Muscles, joints, balance, and energy systems were not only supporting isolated tasks, they were supporting a way of life in which movement remained close to necessity. Once that necessity softened, even slightly, the body no longer had to hold itself in exactly the same relationship to distance, terrain, and repeated effort. This does not mean that later humans became inactive. It means that movement began to change from something constant and unavoidable into something more structured by place. Familiarity itself reduces a certain kind of strain. When the body returns again and again to the same spaces, it no longer has to adjust to entirely new terrain with the same frequency. When resources can be sought within a more stable range, movement becomes more patterned. When shelter can be revisited, even imperfectly, effort is no longer spread across the same open uncertainty. Over generations, this alters what the body is practicing most often. Instead of being trained by the repeated need to remain in motion across shifting conditions, it begins to live under a rhythm where motion and pause are more clearly separated. That separation is subtle, but it changes the meaning of effort. In the older world, effort often blended into the day without a clean starting point or end point. In the newer pattern, effort could begin to cluster more distinctly, followed by clearer intervals of reduced demand. A body shaped by the first pattern is built for continuity. A body shaped by the second begins to adapt to sequence. This change may help explain why the human body can still perform prolonged movement, yet often seems to prefer interruption, shelter, and return. It is not only a cultural habit. It may reflect a long transition in the structure of movement itself. The body still carries the deep inheritance of a world where distance and uncertainty were closely linked, but it has also passed through many generations in which movement no longer had to remain equally constant. Once the environment allowed for more repetition of place, more stable use of territory, and more predictable pathways through the world, the physical systems that supported uninterrupted movement were no longer reinforced in quite the same way. They did not disappear. They simply became less central to the average shape of daily life. This is another way the end of the Ice Age may have changed the body without producing a dramatic break. It did not remove movement, but it changed its rhythm. And when the rhythm of movement changes, the body begins to change with it, slowly leaning away from the old discipline of continuous distance and toward a different balance, one where place matters more, routes become more familiar, and effort is no longer held under the same constant requirement as before. As movement becomes more patterned and less tied to constant uncertainty, the body begins to experience distance in a different way. In the earlier world, distance was not always something to be measured or planned. It was something that emerged from necessity, shaped by conditions that could shift without warning. The body had to remain capable of covering ground, because the alternative was often risk. There was little distinction between moving to survive and simply continuing through the day. That continuity meant that distance did not always appear as a separate challenge. It was part of the background, absorbed into the rhythm of living. When environments begin to stabilize, even slightly, distance starts to take on clearer boundaries. Movement may still be required, but it is more likely to follow repeated paths, known directions and familiar patterns. The body, in response, begins to organize itself around these patterns. Instead of maintaining a constant readiness to move across unknown terrain, it can begin to rely on the predictability of certain routes and the expectation of return. This expectation changes how effort is distributed. It allows movement to be divided into segments, where the body can anticipate both the start and the end of a journey more clearly. Over time, this alters how physical systems are used. Muscles are no longer engaged in the same uninterrupted way, and joints no longer experience the same continuous variation in terrain. Instead, the body begins to repeat similar motions more often, adjusting within a narrower range of conditions. This repetition can reduce certain forms of strain while introducing others, but most importantly, it changes the pattern of reinforcement. What the body practices most often becomes more consistent, but also more limited in variation. This is a different kind of adaptation from the one shaped by constant environmental change. It does not require the body to remain equally prepared for all possibilities. It allows the body to become more specialized within the conditions it encounters most frequently. At the same time, the presence of more predictable movement introduces a clearer relationship between effort and rest. When routes are known and distances are more defined, the body can begin to anticipate when movement will end and when recovery can begin. This anticipation is subtle, but it influences how effort is experienced. In a world of continuous movement, effort is ongoing and recovery is uncertain. In a world of patterned movement, effort can be followed by more expected intervals of rest. Over generations, this changes how the body approaches exertion. It may begin to invest energy differently, knowing that recovery is more likely to occur. This does not eliminate fatigue, but it alters how fatigue is integrated into activity. Fatigue can become a signal that aligns more closely with the structure of movement, rather than a constant background condition that must be endured. Another consequence of this shift is that the body no longer needs to maintain the same level of adaptability to entirely new terrains. In earlier conditions, moving into unfamiliar environments required continuous adjustment in balance, coordination, and energy use. The body had to respond to uneven ground, changing climates, and unpredictable obstacles. As movement becomes more tied to familiar spaces, this demand begins to lessen. The body still adapts, but it does so within a more stable framework. This can gradually reduce the emphasis on broad adaptability, replacing it with a more focused set of responses suited to repeated conditions. Over long periods, such changes can influence how the body experiences both movement and limitation. The ability to continue across varied and uncertain terrain may become less central, while the ability to manage effort within known patterns becomes more important. This does not represent a loss in a simple sense. It represents a shift in what the body is most often required to do. And as with other changes after the Ice Age, what is required most often is what shapes the body most deeply. When movement is no longer defined by constant uncertainty, the systems that supported that uncertainty are used less consistently. They remain part of the body's inheritance, but they are no longer reinforced with the same frequency. In this way, the body begins to move away from the conditions that once shaped its capacity for continuous distance and toward a different relationship with space. One where movement is still present, but organized by repetition, expectation, and the possibility of return. As this shift toward more patterned movement continues across generations, its effects begin to reach deeper than distance or terrain alone. The body is not only responding to how far it travels, but to the structure within which movement is repeated. In a world where motion is guided by familiarity, the body gradually becomes less defined by the need to adjust to entirely new conditions at every step. Instead, it begins to settle into rhythms that are more predictable, where the same paths, the same surfaces, and the same general patterns of effort appear again and again. This repetition does not remove difficulty, but it changes its form. The body is no longer practicing the same wide range of responses as frequently as before. It is practicing a narrower set, reinforced by the regularity of place. Over long periods, this kind of repetition can shape how the body experiences both effort and variation. In earlier conditions, variation was constant. The ground could shift, the weather could change, and the demands placed on balance, coordination, and endurance could alter from one day to the next. This required a kind of readiness that was broad and flexible. The body did not specialize in a narrow range of movement because the environment did not allow for it. Once movement becomes tied to more stable environments, the need for that constant variation begins to diminish. The body can begin to rely on repeated patterns, adjusting within them rather than across entirely new situations. This change may seem small, but it influences how the body organizes its capabilities. Systems that once had to remain open to many possibilities can begin to focus more on what is most commonly encountered. This does not mean that the body loses its ability to adapt. It means that adaptation becomes more specific, more closely aligned with repeated conditions. At the same time, the presence of more predictable movement allows the body to develop a clearer sense of pacing. When routes are known and effort is structured, the body can begin to anticipate how energy should be distributed across a given task. This anticipation changes the internal experience of movement. Instead of adjusting moment by moment to uncertain demands, the body can begin to plan in a subtle biological sense how to move through a sequence of effort and recovery. Over generations, this can influence how endurance is expressed. The earlier form of endurance, shaped by continuous and uncertain movement, gives way to a form that is more segmented, more aligned with the structure of repeated activity. This does not necessarily reduce the body's capacity for movement, but it changes the way that capacity is used and maintained. Another consequence of this shift is that the body may begin to encounter its limits in a different way. In a world of constant variation, limits are often approached gradually, as part of an ongoing adjustment to changing conditions. In a world of repetition, limits can become more defined, appearing at similar points within repeated patterns of effort. This can make them more noticeable, more clearly linked to specific phases of activity. The body may begin to recognize these limits earlier, not because they are new, but because they are encountered in a more structured context. This creates the impression that effort leads more quickly to fatigue, even if the underlying capacity remains complex and adaptable. When viewed in this light, the end of the Ice Age did not simply change how humans moved across the world. It changed how movement itself was experienced within the body. The transition from constant, uncertain motion to more patterned and familiar movement altered the balance between flexibility and repetition, between continuous adjustment and structured pacing. Over many generations, this shift contributed to a gradual reorganization of physical systems, one that reflects a world where movement is no longer held under the same continuous demand. The body still carries the memory of that earlier form, but it no longer lives within the same conditions that required it to be expressed at all times. And as with other changes that followed the retreat of the ice, this transformation does not appear as a sudden loss, but as a quiet redirection, where the body slowly leans toward the patterns it now encounters most often, even if those patterns no longer match the full range of conditions that once shaped human endurance. As climates became more stable in many regions after the Ice Age, another slow change began to shape the human body, not through cold itself and not through movement alone, but through the growing possibility of remaining near the same places for longer stretches of time. This did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not mean that people immediately stopped moving. Human life remained difficult, uncertain, and deeply tied to the environment. But in some landscapes, the world began to allow a new pattern, one in which certain places could be returned to more regularly, used more repeatedly, and known more intimately across seasons. That change may seem small when compared with the retreat of massive ice sheets, yet for the body it carried long consequences. A body formed in a world of repeated adjustment does not remain unchanged when the world begins to offer greater continuity of place. During the colder ages, uncertainty had made movement part of survival, and survival part of movement. The body had to remain responsive to shifting ground, shifting weather, and shifting access to food. Once some environments became more predictable, that pattern began to loosen. The possibility of revisiting the same sheltering areas, the same water sources, or the same resource zones meant that effort could begin to organize itself around familiarity rather than constant relocation. Familiarity changes the body in quiet ways. It reduces the need to treat every stretch of land as uncertain. It allows the body to interact with space not only as something crossed, but as something remembered and reused. Over generations, this matters because the body is shaped not just by extreme events, but by the repeated structure of daily life. If daily life includes more stable use of place, then the pressures acting on the body begin to change. A body that once had to remain broadly prepared for many shifting conditions may begin to live within narrower, more repeated ones. This does not mean those conditions were easy. A repeated place can still be harsh, food can still fail, weather can still turn, and hardship can still return. But the body no longer has to respond to uncertainty in exactly the same diffuse and continuous way. Some effort can begin to cluster around known tasks in known landscapes. Some recovery can begin to happen within places that are revisited rather than constantly abandoned. This changes the emotional and biological meaning of space itself. The body is not only moving through the environment, it is starting, in some cases, to remain in a relationship with it. That relationship introduces a new rhythm. Instead of the older pattern in which life is shaped by broad environmental instability, there is now, in certain regions, a growing possibility that effort will be organized around recurring places and repeated routines. The body responds to this shift not by becoming weaker in a simple sense, but by gradually adjusting to a world in which continuous large-scale uncertainty is less dominant. When places become more familiar, the body can begin to lean more heavily on repeated pathways, repeated expectations, and repeated cycles of effort and pause. Over time, this can reduce the need for the same degree of broad readiness that the Ice Age had once required. Another consequence of this change is that the body begins to experience time differently through place. In a world of constant adjustment, time is often tied closely to immediate conditions. In a world where certain places can be used repeatedly, time begins to gather around return, anticipation, and seasonal familiarity. The body can begin to pace itself not only according to what is happening now, but according to what is expected to happen again. This expectation changes how effort is distributed and how recovery is imagined. It allows a more structured relationship between strain and relief, because the environment itself has become less fragmented. The significance of this shift is easy to underestimate because it appears gradual and ordinary, yet across generations, the growing role of repeated place may have altered how the body balanced endurance, movement, and energy. The body still carried the inheritance of the colder world, but it was now being shaped by a pattern in which continuity of place mattered more than before. That marks another step away from the conditions that had once held human endurance under constant environmental pressure. The body did not leave its Ice Age origin behind, but it began to live farther from it, in landscapes where survival could sometimes be organized around staying, returning, and repeating, rather than only crossing, searching, and enduring without pause. As the possibility of remaining near familiar places became more common in certain regions, the structure of daily life began to shift in ways that were subtle but persistent. The body was no longer responding only to a world that required constant repositioning. Instead, it began to engage with environments that could be revisited, observed over time, and understood through repeated experience. This does not imply stability in a modern sense, but it introduces a degree of continuity that had been less available before. Continuity changes how the body prepares for effort. In a world where conditions are largely unpredictable, preparation must remain broad and open, because the next demand cannot be easily anticipated. In a world where certain patterns begin to repeat, even imperfectly, preparation can become more specific. The body can begin to rely on the expectation that similar tasks will return, that certain movements will be performed again, and that certain forms of strain will follow recognizable patterns. Over generations, this alters how physical systems are used and reinforced. Muscles are engaged not only for general endurance, but for recurring types of effort. Energy is allocated not only for immediate survival, but in anticipation of known cycles. Even the sense of timing within the body begins to align with these repeated experiences, allowing a more structured relationship between exertion and recovery. This shift toward repeated patterns introduces a new kind of efficiency. It is not the efficiency of doing more with less in a single moment, but the efficiency of becoming accustomed to a narrower range of demands. The body becomes practiced within those demands, reducing the need for constant adjustment. While this can make certain activities feel more manageable, it also means that the broader adaptability once required by shifting environments is used less frequently. Adaptability does not disappear, but it is no longer exercised in the same wide and continuous way. Over long periods, this can influence how the body balances its capabilities. Systems that were once shaped to respond to a wide range of conditions may begin to focus more on what is encountered most often. This creates a body that is well suited to its immediate environment, but less consistently reinforced in capacities that are no longer regularly tested. Another consequence of this emerging continuity is that the body can begin to rely more on the idea of return. In earlier conditions, movement was often directed outward, shaped by the need to follow changing resources or avoid shifting threats. With the growing possibility of revisiting the same locations, movement gains a cyclical element. The body begins to experience effort not only as a forward motion, but as part of a loop that includes departure and return. This loop changes how effort is perceived. It introduces a clearer expectation that strain will end, that relief will follow, and that certain conditions can be regained. Over time, this expectation can influence how the body responds to discomfort and fatigue. When relief is uncertain, discomfort may be endured as part of an ongoing state. When relief is more predictable, even if still limited, discomfort may more often lead to a shift in activity because the environment allows for that response. This does not mean that the body becomes less capable of enduring strain. It means that it is less frequently required to endure without interruption. The difference lies in the pattern of use. The body adapts most strongly to what it practices repeatedly, and if uninterrupted endurance is practiced less often, it becomes less central to the body's default mode of operation. Across generations, this gradual shift contributes to a reorganization of how effort, recovery, and movement are integrated. The body begins to function within a framework where repetition and return are as important as variation and exploration. This does not erase the older capacities shaped by the Ice Age, but it places them within a new context, where they are no longer reinforced with the same consistency. The human body continues to carry the deep imprint of a world defined by uncertainty and constant demand, but it is now also shaped by a world where patterns can repeat, where places can be known, and where the rhythm of life can include cycles rather than only continuous adjustment. It is within this changing rhythm that the body slowly moves further from the exact conditions that once defined its endurance, not by losing its past, but by living for long enough within a different present. As this repeated use of place continues across generations, it begins to change not only where the body moves, but what the body is being asked to remain ready for. In the earlier world, shaped by the long cold ages, readiness had to remain broad because the environment itself remained broad in its uncertainty. The body had to carry within it the possibility of sudden movement, prolonged strain, and incomplete recovery, not as rare events, but as recurring features of life. Once certain landscapes became more familiar and could be used again and again, that broad readiness no longer had to stay equally active at all times. The body could begin, slowly, to narrow its expectations around the patterns it met most often. This narrowing is not dramatic. It does not happen as a visible collapse of older capacities. It happens through repetition. When the same places are revisited, the same routes retraced, and the same general tasks repeated, the body is trained less by open uncertainty and more by known conditions. What had once been a wide field of possible demands becomes, in some regions, a more limited field of likely demands. Over time, this changes how effort is organized. The body no longer has to remain equally prepared for constant environmental surprise. It can begin to invest more deeply in recurring forms of movement, recurring forms of rest, and recurring forms of strain. This may sound like a gain in efficiency, and in many immediate ways it is. Familiarity allows energy to be spent with more confidence. It allows movement to be paced according to known distances. It allows effort to be divided with a stronger expectation of return. But every gain in repeated efficiency also changes what the body practices less. The old discipline of staying ready for shifting conditions, shifting terrain, and shifting scarcity begins to soften when those shifts no longer define everyday life with the same force. That softening matters because the body is always being shaped by what it must do most often, not by what it only occasionally still can do. In this sense, the growing continuity of place after the Ice Age did not merely make life more manageable in some areas. It changed the biological meaning of the day itself. A day no longer had to be organized entirely around uncertainty. It could begin to gather around repetition. The body, in turn, could begin to rely on that repetition. Once it does, fatigue is no longer woven into experience in quite the same way. In a world of broad uncertainty, fatigue often exists without a clear promise that stopping will help. In a world of familiar cycles, fatigue becomes easier to interpret as a signal within a pattern. It can point toward expected pause, expected shelter, expected return. Over generations, that changes how the body responds to discomfort. Discomfort becomes more closely linked to transitions in activity rather than something that must simply be carried forward through whatever comes next. This does not make the body fragile, it makes the body differently organized. It still comes from the older world, but it is no longer being held under the same continuous test. The deeper consequence is that continuity of place begins to replace continuity of strain. Earlier, what remained constant was pressure. Now, in some environments, what remains constant is pattern. That is a profound shift. Pressure had once sharpened the body through overlap, forcing warmth, movement, and uncertainty into the same daily experience. Pattern instead shapes the body through repetition, guiding it toward narrower expectations and more structured rhythms. The body adapts to both, but not in the same way. Under pressure, it learns to continue. Under pattern, it learns to anticipate. And anticipation changes everything from pacing to recovery to the point at which effort begins to feel difficult. This is why the growing role of familiar place may have carried such long effects after the Ice Age. It did not need to erase older capacities to begin moving the body away from them. It only needed to make them less central to ordinary life. Once that happened, the body could begin leaning toward a different balance, one less defined by constant readiness for uncertainty and more defined by repeated engagement with the known world. In that slow lean carried across many generations, the human body did not become disconnected from its older origins. It simply became less tightly held by them. And that loosening, almost too gradual to notice from within, is part of why the body that once endured the Ice Age did not remain exactly the same once the ice was gone. As the world moved further away from the long, continuous pressures of the Ice Age, another quiet shift began to take shape, one that is less visible than changes in movement or climate. But just as important for understanding the body, the human body is not only shaped by what it can do, but by how often it is required to prove what it can do. During the colder ages, many of the body's capacities were not left unused for long. They were tested repeatedly, sometimes gently, sometimes more severely, but often enough to remain active as part of everyday life. Cold required constant regulation, movement required steady effort, and uncertainty required the ability to continue without full recovery. These were not occasional challenges. They were conditions that returned again and again, reinforcing the same broad set of responses across generations. When the Ice Age receded and environments became more varied and, in some places, more stable, this pattern of repeated testing began to change. The body was still capable of enduring strain, but it was no longer asked to do so with the same frequency. Many of the conditions that once kept certain systems active became less constant. This does not mean that those systems disappeared. It means they were engaged less often, sometimes in isolation rather than in combination, and sometimes not at all for extended periods. Over time, this introduces a new dynamic. The body begins to carry capacities that are no longer regularly called into use. These capacities remain part of the body's structure, but they are no longer sharpened by repeated necessity. This difference between having a capacity and using it consistently is subtle, but it has long-term consequences. A system that is used often remains closely integrated into daily function. A system that is used less often can become less central, even if it remains present. This is not a sudden change. It is a gradual shift in emphasis, where the body reorganizes itself around what it experiences most frequently. One way to understand this is to consider how the absence of repeated testing affects readiness. In earlier conditions, readiness had to be maintained at all times, because the environment could demand it without warning. The body could not rely on long periods of ease, and so it remained prepared for overlapping challenges. When those challenges become less frequent or more separated, the need for constant readiness begins to ease. The body can begin to relax its baseline level of preparation, not because it has lost the ability to respond, but because it is no longer required to hold that response in a constant state of activation. Over generations, this can influence how quickly and how often certain systems are brought into use. The threshold for engaging them may rise, or the conditions under which they are activated may change. Another consequence of reduced testing is that the body begins to rely more on conditions that allow it to avoid strain rather than endure it. In a world where strain is constant, avoidance is limited. In a world where strain is more intermittent, avoidance becomes more possible. This does not mean that the body becomes dependent on ease, but it does mean that it can begin to operate within a pattern where strain is less central to daily life. Over time, this changes how the body balances effort and conservation. Systems that once had to remain active across long stretches of time can begin to operate in shorter bursts, followed by more complete periods of rest. This again shifts the pattern of reinforcement. What is practiced most often becomes the new baseline, while what is practiced less often becomes less central. In this context, the idea of not fully recovering after the Ice Age takes on another layer of meaning. The body did not lose its abilities in a simple way, it lost the constant requirement to demonstrate them. And when a capacity is no longer required to be demonstrated regularly, it begins to change in how it is maintained, how it is expressed, and how it is integrated into daily life. The human body still carries the imprint of a world that demanded continuous readiness, but it now lives in a world where that readiness is not always needed. Between those two conditions, a quiet shift has taken place, one that cannot be seen in a single moment, but becomes clearer when traced across the long distance between the Ice Age and the present. When repeated testing begins to fade from daily life, the body does not simply become less active, it begins to change its relationship to effort itself. In the older world, shaped by the long cold ages, effort was not something that arrived as a separate event. It was woven into the normal condition of staying alive. The body had to regulate temperature, continue moving, manage uneven access to food, and remain functional while rarely enjoying complete recovery. Under those conditions, many systems stayed close to the surface of daily use. They were called upon often enough that readiness became part of the body's ordinary state. Once the environment began to soften in some regions, and once the rhythm of life allowed more predictable pause, more familiar ground, and more separated demands, the body no longer had to keep all of those systems equally near the surface. This shift matters because repeated testing does not only preserve capacity, it also preserves immediacy. A body that is often required to continue under strain does not have to search far within itself for the means to do so. The ability is not hidden in reserve. It is already in motion, already integrated into the day. But when the same demands arrive less often, the body can begin to treat them differently. It may still be capable of meeting them, yet it no longer keeps them at the same level of constant readiness. Over generations, that difference changes how effort feels from the inside. Strain may seem to arrive sooner, not because the body has suddenly become incapable, but because the pathways of sustained response are less continuously practiced. They remain present, but they are drawn upon less frequently, and so they are less woven into the ordinary rhythm of life. This can be understood by thinking about how the body balances what must remain active and what can remain in reserve. In a world of continuous environmental pressure, reserve has limited meaning, because much of what the body can do must stay available all the time. In a world where demands are more intermittent, the body can afford to leave more in reserve. It can allow certain responses to become less immediate, because the environment no longer insists on their constant use. This does not remove endurance or tolerance. It changes their position within the body's everyday organization. What had once been central becomes more conditional. What had once been constantly reinforced becomes more dependent on circumstance. Another important change follows from this. When systems are no longer repeatedly tested together, they begin to lose some of the old integration that once made them part of a single continuous response. In the colder world, movement, heat regulation, hunger, fatigue, and uncertainty often overlapped. The body adapted to that overlap. It did not confront each demand separately. It carried them in combination. As conditions changed after the Ice Age, these demands began to separate more often. The body could face effort without severe cold. It could face cold without continuous movement. It could recover without the same constant background drain. This separation alters not only how often systems are used, but how they work together. The body begins to respond in parts more often than as a whole. Over long periods, this changes the feeling of sustained strain. It becomes less familiar as an ordinary state, and more recognizable as a specific condition. That difference may help explain why the modern body often notices fatigue so clearly. The body is not necessarily less capable in every sense, but it has spent thousands of years in conditions where continuous full-body testing was less central. Once strain is no longer the quiet background of life, it becomes easier for the body to register it as interruption rather than as normality. This is one of the deepest consequences of reduced testing. The body does not need to lose its old capacities to live differently from them. It only needs to stop exercising them so constantly that they define the baseline. Seen this way, the end of the Ice Age did not simply remove hardship. It changed the frequency, the overlap, and the ordinary presence of hardship in the body's day. What followed was not the disappearance of endurance, but its gradual movement away from the center of daily life. And when endurance is no longer central, the body still remembers it, but it no longer lives inside it in the same unbroken way as before. As this reduced pattern of testing continues over long stretches of time, the body begins to settle into a different baseline, one that is shaped not by the extremes it can reach, but by the conditions it encounters most often. This distinction is important because it explains how a body can still carry deep capacities while no longer organizing itself around them. During the Ice Age, the boundary between ordinary life and physical strain was often unclear. Many of the body's systems were engaged at the same time, and the difference between maintaining life and exerting effort was narrow. That overlap meant that the body was constantly practicing how to continue under layered demands. Once those layers begin to separate, the body no longer lives inside that same continuous state. It begins to move between states more distinctly, and over generations those distinctions become part of its normal rhythm. In such a rhythm, effort is something that begins and ends more clearly. It is not always present in the background. Because of this, the body can begin to experience effort as a shift away from its resting condition rather than as a constant extension of it. This changes how the body approaches both movement and fatigue. Fatigue, which once had to be managed within ongoing activity, can now more often signal a transition. It can indicate that a period of effort is nearing its end, rather than simply becoming another layer within a continuous state. Over time, this alters the internal meaning of strain. The body does not necessarily become less capable of enduring it, but it becomes less accustomed to holding it as a steady background condition. Another effect of this shift is that the body begins to depend more on the structure of its environment to regulate effort. When testing is constant, the body must regulate itself largely from within, adjusting to whatever conditions arise. When testing becomes less frequent and more separated, the environment begins to play a greater role in shaping when effort occurs and when it ends. Shelter, repeated places, and predictable patterns of activity begin to define the boundaries of strain. The body adapts to these boundaries, aligning its internal responses with external structure. Over generations, this creates a system where effort is more closely tied to context, rather than being an ongoing requirement regardless of context. This can gradually reduce the need for the body to maintain a high level of internal readiness at all times. Instead, readiness becomes more situational, activated when needed rather than sustained continuously. This shift from constant to situational readiness has long-term consequences. It allows the body to conserve energy during periods of low demand, but it also means that the systems required for sustained strain are not engaged as frequently. As a result, they may become less central to how the body organizes itself. The body still retains the ability to draw on them, but they are no longer the foundation of daily function. This can make the return to sustained effort feel more difficult, not because the body is incapable, but because it is moving away from a baseline that once included continuous strain. The difference lies in the starting point. A body that begins from a state of ongoing demand approaches effort differently from one that begins from a state of relative rest. Over long periods, this change in baseline can influence how quickly effort feels taxing and how readily the body shifts toward recovery. In this sense, the end of the Ice Age did not remove the human capacity for endurance. It changed the conditions under which that endurance was practiced and maintained. The body still carries within it the possibility of sustained effort, but it no longer lives in a world that requires that effort to be present at all times. What follows is a gradual reorientation, where endurance becomes one of many possible states rather than the default condition of life. This reorientation is subtle, but it helps explain why the body today can feel both capable and limited at the same time. It is capable because it still comes from a lineage shaped by continuous strain. It can feel limited because it has spent thousands of years adapting to a world where that strain is no longer constant. Between these two realities, the body has settled into a different balance, one that reflects not a loss of ability, but a change in what is most often required. And, as with other changes that followed the retreat of the ice, this shift does not arrive as a clear break. It emerges slowly, carried through generations, until the body that once lived under constant testing now lives with those tests appearing only from time to time, no longer forming the quiet foundation of every day. As the body moved further away from the constant pressures of the Ice Age, another deep change began to unfold through generations rather than within individual lives. The environment was no longer filtering human bodies in quite the same way. During the colder ages, survival pressures had been broad, repeated, and often difficult to escape. This meant that the gap between bodies that could continue under strain and bodies that struggled more severely may have mattered more often in daily life. Not in a dramatic or absolute sense, and not in a way that allows simple stories about who survived and who did not, but in the quieter evolutionary sense that repeated conditions shape which traits remain central across populations. When those repeated conditions begin to loosen, the filtering process itself also changes. This matters because the body is not only shaped by climate, movement, and energy use, it is also shaped by how each generation passes through those pressures into the next. Once the end of the Ice Age introduced more varied and, in some places, more stable conditions, the demands placed on survival were no longer organized around the same relentless combination of cold, uncertainty, and continuous strain. Hardship remained real, but it changed form. Some traits that had once been closely tied to surviving the older world were no longer tested with the same frequency or intensity, and when traits are no longer filtered through constant demand, more variation can persist across generations. This is one of the quietest but most important changes after the Ice Age. Earlier, certain capacities may have remained more central because the environment kept returning to them. The ability to tolerate cold, continue under fatigue, manage energy under prolonged strain, and function in unstable conditions would have remained broadly relevant. Once those demands became less consistent, the body no longer had to be narrowed around them in the same way. This does not mean that later populations became weak in any simple sense. It means that the range of bodies and responses that could continue into the next generation may have widened in certain respects. A world with less constant cold and more structured environments allows survival to depend on a more varied mixture of traits, behaviors, and circumstances. Over long periods, that shift changes the average shape of what the body is being filtered for. Instead of a strong and repeated emphasis on continuous endurance under environmental pressure, there can be a broader tolerance for bodies that function well under more segmented and situational demands. This widening does not create a sudden transformation. It accumulates slowly, generation by generation, as the environment applies less force in one direction and allows more room in others. That is why population structure matters here. The body is never only an individual inheritance. It is the result of many generations passing through particular kinds of conditions. If those conditions change, then the population changes in how it distributes traits, in how widely certain capacities vary, and in what it continues to reinforce most strongly. After the Ice Age, some human groups still lived in difficult climates and under demanding conditions, but the overall structure of life in many regions had shifted enough that the older pattern was no longer universal in the same way. This matters because a trait does not need to disappear from a species to become less central to its common baseline. It only needs to stop being reinforced as consistently across the population as a whole. Another layer of this generational change is that once the environment becomes more varied, different local conditions begin to shape bodies in different ways. Under the long reach of Ice Age pressures, some broad demands may have remained more similar across large spans of time and space. Afterward, as regions stabilized differently, the filtering of bodies could become more locally shaped. This increases diversity of response, but it can also reduce the shared centrality of the older endurance pattern. What had once been a more common background condition becomes, over time, one possibility among many. In that sense, the body that emerged after the Ice Age was not simply moving away from cold. It was also moving into a world where the old filters no longer acted with the same reach across generations. And when filters weaken, the form they once helped preserve begins to loosen, not because evolution stops, but because it is now being guided by a different set of repeated conditions. As this generational filtering grows weaker, the body begins to change not only in what it can still do, but in how consistently certain older capacities remain common across many lives. During the long cold ages, the world itself acted as a repeated narrowing force. Not every body faced the same conditions, and not every region demanded the same responses, but over very long stretches of time, the pressures of cold, unstable movement and uncertain recovery returned often enough to keep certain broad capacities close to the center of survival. What mattered was not perfection. What mattered was repeated adequacy under difficult conditions. Once those conditions began to loosen after the Ice Age, repeated adequacy could take more than one form. This is where the generational story becomes especially important. A body does not move through evolutionary time alone. It moves as part of a population, and populations change when the world stops pressing them in one dominant direction. In the earlier world, certain traits may have remained more regularly reinforced because they were tied so closely to daily endurance. In the later world, the same traits could remain useful without being equally decisive in every generation. That difference changes the texture of inheritance. Variation that might once have been narrowed more firmly can now remain in circulation, simply because the environment no longer removes it with the same consistency. This does not produce weakness in any simple sense. It produces breadth. More kinds of bodies, more kinds of tolerance, and more kinds of responses can persist when the world allows survival to pass through multiple pathways rather than a narrower one. Over time, that breadth reshapes what feels normal within the population. The old capacities do not vanish, but they become less evenly distributed as a shared baseline. Some individuals may still show strong endurance under cold, long effort, or discomfort. Others may be less inclined toward those same responses, yet still survive, reproduce, and pass forward their traits in environments where such differences are no longer punished as strictly by daily life. The result is subtle but lasting. The body of the species begins to carry a wider spread of possibilities, while the older Ice Age pattern becomes less universal as a common default. This matters because people often imagine evolution as a march toward improvement or decline, or a clear replacement of one body by another. But much of the time, what changes is not a single trait disappearing or appearing. What changes is the strength of the filter that once held a group around a narrow set of conditions. When that filter weakens, the body becomes more varied in how it approaches strain, recovery, temperature, and effort. That variation itself becomes part of the new human condition. Another effect follows from this widening. Once populations are no longer being shaped as strongly by the same broad environmental pressure, local conditions begin to matter more. Different landscapes, different food systems, different movement patterns, and different ways of using space can all begin to influence bodies with greater independence. This does not mean humanity loses its shared origin. It means that the old Ice Age background, once powerful enough to help preserve a certain broad endurance pattern, no longer dominates in the same way everywhere. Across generations, that weakens the common hold of those older capacities as a species-wide center. What had once been a stronger shared alignment with cold world pressure becomes, gradually, a less universal inheritance in daily function. Seen this way, the question of why humans never fully recovered after the Ice Age becomes less mysterious. Recovery would imply a return to some stable, stronger state after hardship ended. But that is not how long-term biological change works. The end of the Ice Age did not restore the body to a previous form. It changed the filters acting on future generations. Once those filters changed, the body began to spread out into a broader range of possible responses, shaped by new patterns of survival, rather than the old continuous discipline of cold and strain. What follows is not a broken body, but a less tightly unified one. A body still human, still adaptive, still carrying deep traces of its ancient formation, yet no longer held together around the same narrow center that the Ice Age once demanded from generation after generation. As this widening of variation continues across many generations, the meaning of what is typical for the human body begins to shift. In the earlier world, shaped by long periods of cold and instability, what was typical may have been defined more strongly by the repeated demands of that environment. Not every individual body was the same, but the pressures acting on them were similar often enough that certain patterns remained closer to the center. The body, in that sense, was held within a narrower range of responses that were continuously reinforced. When the Ice Age ended and those pressures became less constant, the center itself began to soften. What is typical no longer needs to be as tightly aligned with one dominant pattern of endurance. Instead, the average begins to spread, shaped by a wider set of conditions and a wider range of ways to meet them. This change is not something that can be observed directly in a single generation. It unfolds slowly as the shared background of life becomes more varied. Over time, this alters how the body is organized at the population level. The earlier alignment with continuous strain becomes less uniform, and different balances of effort, recovery, and tolerance can persist side by side. This is one of the reasons why the body today can feel inconsistent when compared to the idea of a past shaped by constant hardship. Some individuals may retain a strong capacity for prolonged effort under discomfort, while others may respond earlier to fatigue or seek rest more quickly. Neither of these patterns is inherently wrong. They reflect a body that is no longer being shaped by a single dominant environmental force, but by many smaller and more varied ones. The result is a form of diversity that did not need to be suppressed as strictly as before. In a world where survival can be achieved through multiple pathways, the body does not have to converge as tightly around one form of endurance. This diversity is often misunderstood as a simple loss of strength or resilience, but it is more accurately a redistribution. The older pattern of continuous endurance does not disappear entirely. It becomes one of several possible ways the body can function, rather than the most consistently reinforced one. Over generations, this shifts how the body approaches effort at a baseline level. The expectation of constant strain fades, replaced by a pattern where strain is one part of a broader range of experiences. Another layer of this change is that the body begins to reflect its more immediate environment more strongly than a distant shared past. In the Ice Age, large-scale pressures such as cold and instability may have provided a kind of common background across wide regions and long periods. Afterward, as conditions diversified, local environments began to play a larger role in shaping how bodies function day to day. This further increases variation, because different groups experience different patterns of movement, energy use, and recovery. The body continues to adapt, but it adapts within these more localized contexts, rather than being guided as strongly by a single global pressure. This creates a situation where the connection to the Ice Age becomes more indirect. The body still carries that inheritance, but it is filtered through many layers of subsequent change. What was once a dominant shaping force becomes part of a deeper background, influencing the body without defining its most immediate patterns. In this way, the idea of not fully recovering takes on a clearer form. There was no single moment of loss, no single trait that disappeared. Instead, the body moved away from a tightly held center and into a broader field of possibilities. The older alignment with continuous endurance became less universal, not because it was no longer possible, but because it was no longer required in the same way across the whole population. The human body, as it exists now, reflects this long transition. It is still capable of remarkable endurance, still able to draw on deep reserves shaped by an ancient world, but it also carries the imprint of thousands of years in which those reserves were not tested in the same continuous way. Between these two histories, the body has settled into a different balance, one that does not return to the conditions of the Ice Age, and does not fully leave them behind either. The human body today exists in a strange position. It still carries traces of the world that shaped it during the long cold ages, yet it no longer lives under the same terms that once made those traits central to survival. This is why the present body can feel both familiar and slightly mismatched at the same time. It belongs to a species that was formed under conditions of continuous strain, but it now spends its days in environments where strain is more often broken apart, delayed, or softened by structure. The result is not a complete break from the past. It is a body suspended between two worlds, still shaped by an older one, but increasingly organized around another. That in-between condition helps explain why many of the body's responses can seem slightly out of place. It can still endure, but often not in the same uninterrupted way that its deeper history might suggest. It can still adapt, but often within narrower and more patterned conditions than those that originally formed it. During the Ice Age, the body had to remain closely tied to a world where cold, movement, energy strain, and incomplete recovery overlapped as part of ordinary life. These overlapping demands did not create perfection, but they did create a body whose systems were held together by repeated necessity. Warmth could not be assumed, effort could not be neatly separated from survival, and the body had to continue under conditions that rarely allowed full restoration. When those pressures eased after the Ice Age, the body did not forget them. It carried them forward. But carrying an inheritance is not the same as living under the same discipline. Over thousands of years, the environment changed the terms under which the body had to use its older capacities. Movement became more patterned in many regions. Recovery became more distinct. Familiar places and repeated cycles began to matter more. The body still came from the older world, but it no longer had to express that older design with the same constancy. This created a subtle mismatch, not because the body failed to adapt, but because it had been formed in one rhythm and gradually reorganized within another. That mismatch may be one of the most important legacies of the end of the Ice Age. The body still contains systems built for prolonged demand, yet daily life in many later environments no longer required those systems to remain equally near the center of function. They became less constantly tested, less constantly reinforced, and less constantly integrated into the ordinary pattern of living. What remained was a body that still remembered endurance, but no longer practiced it as its everyday baseline. This helps explain why modern experiences of effort can feel strangely divided. The body can still do difficult things, yet it may also reach more quickly for warmth, food, shelter, or pause. It may still hold deep reserves, yet those reserves no longer shape the surface of daily life in the same way. The present body, then, is not simply weaker than the one shaped by the Ice Age, and not simply better adapted to later conditions. It is more complicated than either of those ideas. It is an inherited body living in a transformed world, carrying forward older patterns while also adjusting to new ones. In that sense, it is not fully at home in either place. It still reflects the deep history of cold, scarcity, and steady movement, but it also reflects the long easing that followed, where those same pressures became less unified and less absolute. To live in such a body is to live with two timelines layered together. One timeline reaches back to a world where survival depended on continuous readiness. The other stretches forward through thousands of years in which readiness became more situational, more structured by place, and more shaped by interruption. These timelines do not cancel each other out. They remain together within the body, creating a form that is both ancient and altered. That is why the body can feel as though it comes from somewhere harsher than the world it now inhabits. It does, but it has also spent too long outside that world to remain exactly what it once was. After the Ice Age, the human body did not return to balance. It entered a long in-between state, and in many ways, it may still be there. This in-between condition becomes even clearer when looking at how the body responds to ordinary comfort. A body fully shaped by the world after the Ice Age might be expected to settle easily into warmer shelter, more predictable rhythms, and clearer cycles of effort and rest. But the human body does not always behave that way. It often carries a quiet tension, as though some deeper layer of itself still expects a world that is less forgiving, more demanding, and less certain. This does not mean the body is malfunctioning. It means that its older inheritance has not disappeared, even after thousands of years of living under different conditions. The deeper structure of the human body was not originally formed in a world of stable interiors, repeated ease, or clearly separated forms of effort and recovery. It was formed much earlier, under pressures that kept movement, temperature, hunger, and fatigue closely tied together. When those pressures loosened, the body adapted, but adaptation did not erase memory in the evolutionary sense. What it produced was a layered form, one where the older pattern still exists beneath the newer one. That layering helps explain why the body can feel slightly unsettled even in conditions that appear favorable. It is not simply built for comfort, because comfort was not the world that shaped its deeper rhythms. At the same time, it is no longer fully built for the older world either. It has spent too many generations in landscapes where strain became more segmented, where movement became more patterned, and where recovery became more possible. The result is a body that often seems to hesitate between two modes. Part of it still reflects continuity, the long ability to keep going under low-level strain. Another part reflects interruption, the expectation that effort will end, that warmth can be regained, and that relief is not always far away. These two histories do not blend into perfect harmony. They create friction. That friction can be felt in the way the body approaches discomfort. It still carries systems shaped by persistence, yet it also responds more quickly to the possibility of stopping. It still contains reserves shaped by a harsher world, yet it no longer keeps them as close to the surface of ordinary life. This is one reason the present body can feel both resilient and fragile, sometimes within the same day. It can tolerate difficulty, but it may also seem to resist it sooner than an older environment would have allowed. The important point is that this is not simply a story of decline. It is a story of partial inheritance. The body has inherited a design from one world and a rhythm from another. Its shape comes from deep time, but its everyday organization has been altered by the long easing that followed the Ice Age. That is why modern life can feel strangely out of scale with the body's deeper origin. Many later environments have reduced the constant overlap of demands that once trained the body through repetition. Warmth can be regained more easily. Movement can be limited. Food can often be approached in ways that are less tied to immediate exposure and effort. Yet the body still carries signs of the old world beneath those later conditions. It does not begin each day as a blank system built only for the present. It begins as the descendant of many older days shaped by continuous demand. In that sense, the body is never fully modern. It always arrives carrying something older than the world it enters. But neither is it fully ancient anymore. It has been living too long in changed conditions to remain tightly matched to the original pressures that formed it. This is the deeper meaning of being between two worlds. The body has not completely left the Ice Age behind, but it has also not remained under its discipline. It still responds with traces of that older formation, yet those traces now exist inside a system reorganized by repetition, shelter, and partial stability. Over generations, this creates a form of quiet mismatch, where the body still remembers continuous strain without living entirely within it. That may be why the human body often feels as though it belongs to a harsher history than the one visible around it. Not because it failed to adapt, but because adaptation after the Ice Age did not mean full replacement. It meant carrying an older body into a newer world, and slowly becoming something that fully belongs to neither. Over time, this layered condition begins to shape not only how the body responds to the world, but how it interprets itself within that world. A body that carries two different histories does not always move through life with a single, unified expectation. Part of it is organized around continuity, around the quiet ability to continue through low-level strain without clear boundaries. Another part is organized around interruption, around the expectation that effort will be followed by rest, that discomfort can lead to relief, and that strain does not need to remain constant. These two patterns do not cancel each other. They coexist, and in that coexistence they create a subtle instability in how the body experiences effort. This instability does not appear as confusion in a conscious sense. It appears as a difference in how the body approaches its limits. When effort begins, the body can still draw on deep reserves shaped by an older world. It can continue longer than expected in some moments, maintaining movement and function even as fatigue grows. Yet at the same time, it may begin to signal strain earlier than that older pattern would suggest, as though part of it expects that continuation is no longer required in the same way. These signals are not errors. They are reflections of a body that has adapted to two different kinds of rhythm across its long history. One rhythm demanded persistence without clear relief. The other allowed for cycles, for pause, and for recovery to play a more visible role. When these rhythms meet within the same body, the result is not a simple compromise. It is a shifting balance, where the body may lean toward one pattern in one moment and toward the other in the next. This helps explain why effort can feel uneven. The body is not operating under a single, consistent expectation. It is drawing from layers that were formed under different conditions. In some situations, the older pattern may dominate, allowing continued effort even when fatigue is present. In others, the newer pattern may take precedence, leading the body to slow, stop, or seek relief sooner. This variability is not random. It reflects the long transition from a world of continuous strain to a world of segmented demand. Another consequence of this layered structure is that the body may no longer maintain the same relationship with its own limits as it once did. In the Ice Age, limits were often encountered gradually, as part of a continuous adjustment to overlapping demands. There was rarely a clear moment when effort began or ended. Instead, the body moved within a narrow margin where continuation was necessary, and limits were something to be managed rather than clearly marked. In later conditions, where effort and rest become more separated, limits can appear more distinctly. They become tied to specific phases of activity, making them easier to recognize and respond to. Over time, this changes how the body experiences reaching its limits. It may feel as though limits are encountered sooner, even if the underlying capacity has not been entirely lost. The difference lies in how those limits are integrated into the rhythm of life. A body shaped by continuous strain treats limits as part of an ongoing state. A body shaped by variation treats them as signals within a cycle. When both of these tendencies exist together, the experience of effort becomes more complex. It can feel as though the body both resists and endures at the same time. This is one of the lasting effects of the transition that followed the Ice Age. The body did not simply replace one pattern with another, it carried one forward while developing the other. The result is a form that is not fully aligned with either extreme. It is not the body of uninterrupted endurance that earlier conditions may have required, nor is it a body designed entirely for comfort and ease. It is something in between, shaped by both histories and constantly adjusting between them. This is why the idea of not fully recovering becomes meaningful in a deeper sense. The body did not fail to regain strength after hardship. It was never returning to a previous state. It was moving through a long transformation, one that replaced constant pressure with variation and continuous testing with intermittent demand. In that transformation, something of the old alignment was left behind, not as a sudden loss, but as a gradual loosening. What remains is a body that still carries the imprint of a harsher world, yet no longer lives within it fully. And because of that, it often feels as though it is still adjusting, even now, to a change that began thousands of years ago and has never truly settled into a single, stable form. What often feels most familiar in the modern body is not its great endurance, but the strange speed with which fatigue can begin to appear. Effort starts, and after a surprisingly short time, the body begins to negotiate. It asks for a pause, for warmth, for food, for a slower pace. This happens even in environments far safer and more stable than the ones that shaped early human life. That contrast can feel puzzling. If the human body comes from a long history of surviving cold, movement, hunger, and uncertainty, why does ordinary strain so often feel close to the surface now? The answer may lie not in a sudden loss of strength, but in the long change in what the body has been required to treat as normal. During the Ice Age, strain was not always marked as a separate event. It was part of the background condition of life. The body had to keep functioning while warmth was costly, while movement was necessary, and while recovery was often incomplete. Under those conditions, fatigue could not always serve as a clear instruction to stop. It had to exist within the ongoing flow of survival, not outside it. The body, in effect, learned to carry fatigue rather than immediately organize itself around escaping it. That does not mean early humans did not feel tired. It means tiredness was woven differently into the structure of daily life. After the Ice Age, as climate softened in many places and patterns of living became more segmented, the meaning of fatigue began to change. Effort and relief were no longer bound together in the same relentless way. The body could begin to encounter clearer pauses, clearer forms of shelter, and clearer intervals between demands. Over generations, this matters because the body adapts not only to what it can survive, but to what it expects will follow strain. If strain is often followed by relief, then fatigue can begin to act more decisively as a signal toward that relief. If strain no longer defines the whole day in the same continuous way, the body no longer has to treat fatigue as something that must always be carried forward. This may be one reason the modern feeling of tiring early is so common. The body still holds older capacities, but it has spent thousands of years in environments where those capacities were not tested through the same continuous overlap of cold, movement, and scarcity. As a result, the threshold at which fatigue becomes noticeable may have shifted closer to the surface of experience. The body can still continue, sometimes much longer than it first suggests, but it often signals discomfort earlier, because the world it has lived in for so long has allowed those signals to matter more. This creates a quiet paradox. The body may still be capable of deep endurance, yet it behaves as though it expects interruption. It still carries the inheritance of a harsher world, yet it now often responds as though relief is near enough to be worth seeking. That tension may be why effort can feel both possible and difficult at once. The body is not lying when it says it is tired early. It is expressing a long history in which the role of fatigue has changed. Fatigue is no longer simply part of the background. It has become more visible, more structured, and more closely tied to the possibility of stepping out of strain. Another layer of this change is that modern life often separates demands that were once combined. The body may move without cold, feel hunger without constant effort, or feel stress without open exposure to the environment. These separated pressures can still be exhausting, but they do not reinforce the older pattern in which endurance was built through repeated overlap. Instead, they create more distinct episodes of effort, each with its own signals of strain. Over time, this makes fatigue feel more immediate and more clearly bounded. It is not only that the body gets tired, it is that it now recognizes tiredness within a different rhythm than the one that originally formed it. Seen this way, early fatigue is not merely a flaw of the present body. It may be one of the clearest signs that the body no longer lives under the same continuous discipline that once shaped it. The human body still remembers the long, cold world, where effort had to continue even when it hurt. But it has lived too long in another world, one where fatigue can speak sooner, and where the body has learned, slowly, to listen. As this shift in how fatigue is experienced continues across generations, it begins to shape not only the moment when tiredness appears, but the way the body responds once it does. In the earlier world, shaped by the long cold ages, responding to fatigue was not always a matter of choice. The environment often limited the ability to stop, to rest fully, or to separate oneself from ongoing demands. Under those conditions, the body developed a way of continuing even when signs of strain were present. Fatigue became something that existed within activity, rather than something that always ended it. The body adjusted its pace, redistributed its energy, and maintained function in a state that was not fully recovered. This pattern created a form of endurance that was less about avoiding fatigue and more about carrying it. Once the Ice Age ended and environments in many regions allowed for clearer intervals of pause, the relationship between fatigue and response began to change. The body could begin to act on signals that once had to be endured. When shelter, familiarity, or predictable cycles made rest more accessible, fatigue could more often lead to reduction in effort rather than continuation through it. Over time, this changes how the body organizes its reactions. Instead of treating fatigue as a condition to be integrated into ongoing activity, it begins to treat it more often as a signal that marks a transition. This shift does not remove the body's ability to continue under strain. It alters how often that ability is required. When continuation is no longer the only option, the body may begin to favor conservation sooner, not because it is less capable, but because the environment allows that preference to exist. Across generations, such changes can influence the baseline response to effort. The body becomes more accustomed to adjusting its behavior when fatigue appears, rather than maintaining output regardless of that signal. This creates a different pattern of interaction between effort and recovery. Recovery becomes more central, not just as a physical process, but as an expected part of the cycle. Fatigue, in turn, becomes more closely linked to the anticipation of that recovery. This relationship may help explain why modern effort often feels shorter in duration, even when the body still holds deeper reserves. The presence of fatigue does not necessarily reflect the total capacity of the body. It reflects the point at which the body begins to shift its response, moving toward rest rather than continuation. In a world where rest is more possible, that shift can occur earlier. Another aspect of this change is that the body may become more sensitive to internal signals when those signals are allowed to influence behavior. In the earlier world, sensitivity alone would not have been enough. The body had to maintain function even when signals of strain were strong. In later conditions, where those signals can be acted upon more readily, sensitivity can play a larger role in shaping behavior. This does not mean the body is weaker. It means the feedback between sensation and response has become more direct. Over time, this can make fatigue feel more immediate, because it is no longer something that must always be suppressed or ignored. It is something that can guide action. When viewed in this way, the experience of tiring early is not only about energy or strength. It is about how the body has learned to respond to its own signals in a changed environment. The earlier pattern required endurance through continuous demand. The later pattern allows for adjustment within a more segmented rhythm. The body adapts to both, but it cannot maintain both as its central mode at the same time. It shifts toward the one it encounters most often. After the Ice Age, that shift gradually moved the body toward a pattern where fatigue is more clearly recognized and more often acted upon. The deeper capacity for endurance remains, but it is no longer held in constant use. It becomes something that can be called upon when needed, rather than something that defines the entire structure of daily life. This distinction is subtle, but it reshapes the lived experience of effort. It explains why the body can still endure when required, yet often chooses to reduce effort sooner when conditions allow. Between these two tendencies, the modern experience of fatigue emerges, not as a simple sign of decline, but as the result of a long transition in how the body relates to strain, recovery, and the possibilities offered by the world around it. What makes this long transition so difficult to notice is that the body still gives occasional glimpses of the older pattern. Under unusual pressure, it can sometimes continue far beyond the point where fatigue first appeared. It can adapt to repeated strain, settle into effort, and reveal reserves that ordinary life does not seem to call upon very often. These moments matter because they show that the older inheritance has not disappeared. The body has not been emptied of the capacities shaped by the colder world. Yet those capacities now tend to appear less as a permanent baseline and more as something that must be awakened by circumstance. In daily life, the body more often moves within a different rhythm, one where effort is interrupted sooner, where fatigue becomes meaningful earlier, and where recovery plays a larger role in organizing action. This contrast between deep reserve and early signal may be one of the clearest signs that the body still stands between two long histories. On one side is the ancient pattern in which tiredness had to be carried as part of continuing. On the other side is the later pattern in which tiredness can redirect behavior more quickly because the environment allows it. The body now contains both. That is why it can feel contradictory. It can seem reluctant at the beginning of effort, and yet unexpectedly durable once effort continues long enough. It can feel as though it reaches its limit early, only to discover that the limit was not final, but provisional, shaped by a body that has learned to negotiate with strain rather than simply absorb it. This does not mean the body is confused. It means that its signals are no longer serving the exact same world they once served. In the Ice Age, a signal of fatigue could not always function as an invitation to stop. It often existed within a situation where stopping carried its own risks. After the Ice Age, as climate softened and rhythms of life became more structured, the same kinds of signals could begin to serve a different purpose. They could become part of a system that helps the body pace itself within cycles of effort and rest. Over generations, this changes what fatigue means. It becomes less of a background condition and more of a marker, a point at which the body begins to reassess rather than simply endure. This may be why the present experience of effort so often feels like negotiation. The body is not only asking whether it can continue, it is also asking whether continuation is necessary, whether relief is available, whether the cost of pressing on still fits the world it now expects. In a harsher environment, that question would have had fewer possible answers. In a more structured environment, it becomes central. Another reason this matters is that it helps explain why modern people can misunderstand their own bodies. Early fatigue can feel like evidence that something essential has been lost, but the body's earlier signal does not necessarily mean a total reduction in human capacity. It may reflect the fact that daily life no longer keeps endurance near the surface in the same way. The body has spent too many generations in conditions where constant strain was no longer the baseline. As a result, endurance remains present, but more often as a deeper layer than an immediate one. The first response to effort is no longer always continuation. It is often evaluation. That change is subtle, but it reshapes how effort feels from the inside. It turns fatigue into something more visible, more influential, and more closely tied to the possibility of adjusting pace. Seen this way, the modern body does not simply fail where the older body succeeded. It speaks sooner. It signals sooner. It leans sooner toward conservation because it has lived for so long in a world where conservation and pause became more possible. Yet beneath that quicker signal, The older body still exists in part, carrying traces of a deeper endurance formed under cold, scarcity, and repetition. The result is a body that does not fully belong to either pattern alone. It often begins like a later body, cautious and responsive to fatigue. But under continued demand, it can sometimes reveal the older body underneath, the one shaped when the world gave fewer chances to stop. That is why the human body after the Ice Age cannot be understood simply as weaker, stronger, improved, or diminished. It is more accurate to say that it has been reorganized around a different expectation of what strain should mean. And once that expectation changes, the feeling of fatigue changes with it, becoming one of the quietest and most personal signs that the long world of ice did not merely end outside us. It left the body carrying a memory of endurance, while teaching it, slowly, to answer that memory in a different way. By the time the long effects of the Ice Age had faded into the background of human history, the body had not returned to some earlier, stronger equilibrium. It had moved too far in another direction for that. This is why it may be more accurate to say that humans did not fail to recover after the Ice Age, but instead continued changing under a different set of pressures, until the meaning of recovery itself no longer fit the story. Recovery suggests a return to balance after a temporary hardship. Yet the Ice Age was not a temporary disturbance in the life of the human body. It was one of the deepest conditions under which that body was formed. Cold, uncertainty, layered strain, and incomplete recovery were not interruptions. They were part of the shaping environment. When that environment changed, the body did not return from difficulty to normal life. Difficulty had been normal life, and the body had been built inside it. Once the climate softened and the structure of daily existence became more varied, more patterned, and in some places more stable, the body was no longer being held under the same discipline. What followed was not restoration. It was redirection. This distinction matters because it changes how the entire question should be understood. The human body did not lose something because history went wrong. It adapted away from a world that no longer existed in the same way. The traits once sharpened by constant cold, continuous movement, and overlapping demands were no longer required as continuously. Some remained, some loosened, some were carried forward as deeper capacities rather than everyday baselines. Over generations, the body reorganized itself around a new average of life. That new average still included hardship, but it did not include the same uninterrupted background of environmental pressure. Instead, it introduced cycles, pauses, repeated places, and a clearer separation between strain and relief. The body followed that shift because bodies always follow what is most often demanded of them. They do not preserve old disciplines indefinitely when the world no longer asks for them with the same force. In that sense, what happened after the Ice Age was not a collapse of the human body, but a quiet movement into another kind of balance, one less centered on continuous endurance and more centered on variation. Yet that new balance never fully erased the older one. The body remained a descendant of the cold world, even while becoming something else. This is why the present body can feel so difficult to define. It still carries the architecture of a harsher age, but it no longer lives under its full training. It still contains reserves shaped by long pressure, but it now organizes daily life around patterns that often allow interruption. It still remembers how to continue, but it now also listens more quickly for reasons to pause. These are not contradictions in the sense of errors. They are the natural result of a body being shaped by one world and then lived through another for thousands of years. What appears, from the surface, as weakness or lost resilience may sometimes be better understood as a change in what the body has practiced most often. The deeper truth may not be that the human body became simply less capable after the Ice Age, but that it became differently aligned. It no longer matched the old conditions perfectly, and it did not fully reinvent itself for the new ones either. It remained between histories, carrying the old inside the new. This is where the idea of never fully recovering becomes most meaningful. The body was never returning to a stable point that existed before hardship. It was moving away from the very world that had once defined its endurance. Once that world ended, the body could only become something else. It could preserve traces, habits, thresholds, and hidden capacities from that older time, but it could not remain held together by a pressure that no longer ruled the day. And so the human body that lives now is not the finished answer to what came after the ice. It is the long result of a transition still visible in fatigue, in effort, in the search for comfort, and in the uneasy feeling that some deeper version of ourselves may have belonged to a world we can no longer return to, and perhaps were never meant to fully leave. From this perspective, the human body begins to appear less like a finished design and more like an ongoing transition. It is not a form that reached completion after the Ice Age, but one that continued to adjust as the conditions around it shifted. This idea can feel unfamiliar, because it moves away from the expectation that the body should settle into a stable and optimal state once the most severe hardships have passed. Yet the long history of change suggests something quieter and more continuous. The body does not arrive at a final version of itself. It keeps moving, shaped by what is repeated most often in the environments it inhabits. After the Ice Age, what was repeated most often began to change in subtle ways. Cold became less constant in many regions. Movement became more patterned, energy use became more segmented, and recovery became more visible within daily life. None of these changes were absolute, and none applied everywhere at the same time, but together they shifted the average conditions under which the body lived. Over many generations, those averages matter more than rare extremes. They determine which traits remain central and which become less emphasized. This is why the body did not return to an earlier form once the cold receded. There was no stable point waiting on the other side of hardship. There was only a new pattern of life, one that continued to shape the body in different ways. In that pattern, some older capacities became less necessary to maintain at the same level. The ability to carry fatigue without interruption, to sustain movement under constant environmental strain, and to manage energy within overlapping demands did not vanish, but they were no longer required with the same consistency. As a result, they moved deeper within the body's range of possible responses, rather than remaining at the center of its everyday function. At the same time, new patterns of organization began to take hold. The body learned to operate within cycles, to respond to clearer signals of fatigue, and to rely more on the possibility of recovery. These changes did not replace the old design completely. They layered on top of it, creating a form that reflects both histories at once. This layered structure is one of the reasons the body can feel difficult to understand. It does not follow a single logic. It carries multiple ones, shaped by different periods of human history. In some moments, it reflects the older world, continuing under strain and drawing on deeper reserves. In other moments, it reflects the later world, responding quickly to fatigue and seeking relief when it becomes available. This is not a contradiction to be resolved. It is a condition to be recognized. The body has not settled into a final balance because the environments that shape it have continued to change. What we experience now is part of that long movement, not its conclusion. When viewed this way, the question of recovery becomes less about what was lost and more about what changed direction. The body did not fail to regain something that once existed. It adapted to a different set of repeated conditions, and in doing so it left behind the exact alignment that had once matched the Ice Age so closely. What remains is a body that still carries the imprint of that alignment, but no longer lives within it fully. This may be why the present can feel slightly out of place within the body itself. The rhythms of modern life often emphasize interruption, repetition, and control over environment, while the deeper structure of the body was formed in a world of continuity, variation, and limited control. The body adapts, but it does so gradually, and it carries its past forward as part of that process. In the end, the human body after the Ice Age is not something that needs to be corrected or restored. It is something that reflects a long history of change, where no single period defines it completely. It is shaped by the cold that once demanded endurance, and by the softer conditions that followed, which allowed endurance to become less central. Between these influences, the body continues to move, not back toward what it was, and not entirely into what it might become, but along a path that remains open, shaped by the same quiet forces that have always guided it, repeating what matters most often, and slowly becoming what those repetitions allow. If there is a final lesson in this long story, it may be a quiet one. The human body was not made incorrectly, and it was not left behind by history in some simple way. It was shaped in a world of cold, uncertainty, repetition, and unfinished recovery, then carried into a world that slowly asked different things of it. That journey did not produce a perfect replacement for what came before. It produced a layered body, one that still carries traces of the older discipline while living inside newer rhythms of effort and relief. This is why the body can feel both capable and uneasy, both durable and easily tired, both ancient and strangely out of place. It is not because the body failed to recover. It is because the end of the Ice Age did not offer a return. It offered a redirection. The pressures that had once kept certain forms of endurance close to the center of daily life began to loosen, and once they loosened, the body could not remain exactly what it had been. It moved, slowly and almost invisibly, toward a different balance. That balance allowed other forms of life to emerge, other patterns of movement, other relationships with warmth, place, effort, and pause. But it also meant that something of the old alignment would become less central. The body did not forget the harder world entirely. It simply stopped being forced to live inside it every day. There is something useful in recognizing this, especially now, because people often judge the body as if it should feel perfectly at ease in the present. Yet the body comes from a much longer history than the spaces it now inhabits. It carries older expectations than the rooms it rests in, older rhythms than the schedules it follows, older pressures than the comforts it reaches for. To understand that is not to romanticize hardship, and not to imagine that the past held a purer or better human form. The colder world was not kinder, and survival within it was not a hidden ideal waiting to be restored. But that world did shape the body in ways that are still faintly visible. It shaped how effort was once carried, how fatigue was once folded into life, and how endurance could remain close to the surface because the environment kept calling it forward. The educational value of this history may be simple but important. It reminds us that the body is not a machine built for one moment in time. It is an archive of older worlds. Its reactions often make more sense when seen not only through the present, but through the deep environments that formed it. The search for warmth, the speed of fatigue, the pull toward rest, and the uneven feeling of effort may all be part of that longer inheritance. To see the body this way is to treat it with more accuracy, and perhaps with more patience. Not because every discomfort has an ancient answer, and not because history excuses every limitation, but because understanding where the body came from can soften the false idea that it should always feel perfectly matched to modern life. The body is still adapting, still negotiating, still carrying forward traces of old pressures into new conditions. In that sense, it is not broken, it is historical. It is the living result of climates, movements, and generations that no longer exist in their original form, yet still remain inside muscle, fatigue, habit, and need. Perhaps that is the deeper meaning of never fully recovering after the Ice Age. It was never a story about losing everything. It was a story about being shaped so deeply by one world that even after that world faded, the body could not simply step free of it and become entirely new. Something older stayed, something newer took hold, and between them, the human body became what it is now, not a finished answer, but a long echo of changing worlds, still asking, in its own quiet way, whether any body shaped by one age can ever fully belong to the next.